Every person in today's video had one thing in common. They were warned, they were told no, they ignored it anyway. I'm Patrick, and today I'll show you the most devastating consequences of Karen unchecked ego. From a Karen who thought a restricted dolphin tank was a prop for her live stream, to a kitchen fire that started the moment someone ignored every warning, and it only gets worse from there. It was May 12, 2018. And a shopping plaza in suburban Houston, Texas was operating at typical weekend capacity, with steady vehicle turnover, moderate pedestrian traffic, and full occupancy in the main parking rows. Nothing about the environment suggested anything beyond routine consumer activity. Vonda Strike, 49, lived a few miles from the plaza and worked part-time in administrative support for a local clinic. She had no reported medical conditions that affected mobility and was described by acquaintances as generally assertive in everyday interactions, particularly in public service settings. She was alone that afternoon, driving a mid-size SUV. The parking lot had a standard layout with marked stalls, a central driving lane, and concrete wheel stops separating vehicles from pedestrian walkways. Surveillance footage later showed consistent vehicle flow, with drivers circling for available spaces due to peak demand. A vehicle had just begun reversing out of a parking space near the front row when Vonda entered the lane behind it. At the same time, another driver had been waiting on the opposite side of the aisle, preparing to move into the newly vacated spot. Both vehicles signaled intent to occupy the same space within seconds of each other. Normally, one driver yields or pauses once the other vehicle commits to reversing, preventing anyone from entering the blind zone at the same time. Vonda exited her vehicle and immediately approached the rear of the reversing car, raising her voice and signaling that the space was already claimed. The driver, noticing her proximity, applied the brake and brought the vehicle to a complete stop to avoid further movement. The engine remained running, and the vehicle stayed partially angled within the lane. Instead of stepping away from the path of the vehicle, Vonda remained directly behind it, continuing the confrontation. She moved backward incrementally as she spoke, maintaining eye contact with the other driver while gesturing toward the space, and refusing repeated attempts by the driver to disengage and continue reversing away. The rear wheels of the vehicle were positioned near a slight elevation change between the driving lane and the pedestrian curb edge. As the argument continued, Vonda shifted her weight backward without checking her footing. Her heel made contact with the raised concrete divider separating the lane from the sidewalk. She lost balance instantly as her heel caught the raised edge of the concrete wheel stop behind her. With her weight already shifted backward mid-step, there was no stable point to recover her footing. Her upper body tilted sharply in a continuous motion, driven by momentum rather than control, and she began to fall straight back toward the pavement. That split second is where everything stops being reversible, and there's no time left to correct positioning. As she went down, her head remained unprotected, with no reflexive movement to brake or slow the impact. The back of her skull struck the concrete wheel stop at close range, creating a direct, concentrated point of contact. The force of the impact was immediate, and her body followed through onto the ground without interruption. She collapsed fully onto the pavement and did not regain responsiveness, remaining motionless in the position where she fell. Bystanders called emergency services immediately. Nearby individuals moved to assist, but she remained unconscious at the scene. Paramedics arrived within minutes and initiated advanced medical response before transporting her to hospital care. Despite intervention, imaging confirmed a severe traumatic brain injury from blunt force impact to the occipital region, resulting in catastrophic internal damage and rapid loss of neurological function. She did not regain consciousness. The incident review, based on witness statements and surveillance footage, confirmed the fall occurred during active verbal escalation while she remained positioned within a vehicle's reversing path and adjacent curb boundary. A routine parking dispute escalates into a brief standoff in a crowded lot, where positioning becomes the critical factor in what follows, before the next case shifts into a different environment involving controlled mechanical systems under human interference.
It was September 18th, 2014. The afternoon sun baked the desert asphalt along Interstate 10 near Mesa, Arizona, casting heat ripples that distorted the lines of traffic moving steadily at 75 miles per hour. Dust devils stirred along the shoulder, lifting small stones and loose paper into brief spirals. Eleanor Brickman, a 67-year-old retired bookkeeper, sat in her unregistered sedan at a gas station tucked between the frontage road and the interstate. Her hand-painted wooden license plate leaned slightly to the left on the bumper, the rough brushstrokes clearly visible to anyone paying attention. For the past 3 years, Eleanor had immersed herself in sovereign citizen ideology, drawn in by online forums she had discovered after her husband's death. Friends and relatives described her as increasingly distrustful of any government authority, convinced that some laws were merely suggestions imposed on the uninformed. Neighbors recalled her repeatedly confronting postal workers over routine deliveries, filming city employees performing inspections, and openly refusing to comply with parking regulations or permit requirements. Eleanor kept a notebook filled with scribbled arguments about voluntary contracts and constitutional loopholes, which she often referred to aloud when explaining her actions to anyone nearby. That afternoon, Eleanor had clashed with a road maintenance worker assigned to shoulder cleanup. He had insisted she could not park her vehicle with a wooden license plate, prompting a heated exchange in which Eleanor loudly declared all vehicle registration to be voluntary contracts she had never signed. The worker threatened to call the police and recalled Eleanor's face flushed. She retreated to her trunk and carefully retrieved a hand-painted stop sign. She announced aloud that she would stage a constitutional demonstration against traffic enforcement, likely convinced that her actions would assert her legal independence. Eleanor walked along an unfenced frontage access point leading to an interstate overpass, then descended to the shoulder of the busy highway through a maintenance gap in the barrier fencing. Multiple witnesses later estimated she stood on the concrete barrier separating the shoulder from the right lane for approximately 30 to 60 seconds, holding her homemade sign and shouting about constitutional rights. At least one motorist later reported calling 911 to report a pedestrian near the lanes, but traffic continued flowing at highway speeds, drivers unaware of the developing situation. Eleanor's behavior escalated as she stepped closer to the active lanes, apparently believing her protest would force vehicles to acknowledge her authority. Eleanor walked directly into the right travel lane of Interstate 10. A traffic monitoring camera mounted near the overpass captured her stepping into the path of oncoming vehicles, her stop sign raised above her head. A commercial semi-truck traveling at highway speed, later estimated between 70 and 75 miles per hour, had no time to react. The driver later reported seeing Eleanor appear suddenly in his lane, but couldn't stop in time. The impact was instantaneous and devastating. Eleanor's body was thrown forward dozens of feet away, landing in the median strip. The truck driver immediately pulled over and called 911. Emergency responders arrived within 8 minutes, with troopers assuming control of the scene, but Eleanor showed no signs of life. The coroner's report detailed massive blunt force trauma, including complete chest compression, severe head injury, and catastrophic internal bleeding. The injuries were deemed unsurvivable, with death occurring within seconds of impact given the forces involved. Traffic backed up for miles as investigators documented the scene, and traffic cameras provided clear evidence of Eleanor's deliberate actions. The truck driver, a 15-year veteran of long-haul driving, left the profession permanently after the incident.
It was August 11, 2016, in Phoenix, Arizona. Heat shimmered off the pavement as rush hour began. Interstate 10 was experiencing moderate traffic as commuters headed out of the city. Angela Merrick, 39, worked in administrative management for a regional logistics company and traveled frequently for short business trips. Colleagues described her as highly organized but easily frustrated when plans changed or schedules slipped. That afternoon, she had requested a rideshare to the airport for a 6:30 p.m. flight and was picked up from her downtown office at 4:45 p.m. From the moment she entered the vehicle, Angela complained about the car's temperature, the music volume, and the route shown on the navigation screen, reminding the driver she traveled often and expected rides to follow her instructions. She demanded a specific route despite his explanation that the app reflected current traffic conditions, interrupting him repeatedly and warning she would leave a negative rating if the route wasn't changed. She emphasized that she had important plans and could not afford delays, maintaining a dismissive tone throughout the exchange. Seated behind the driver, Angela repeatedly leaned forward to watch the navigation screen, questioning each turn while scrolling through her phone. As they merged onto the interstate, she again challenged the route and insisted on an alternate exit, raising her voice and stating the driver should follow customer instructions rather than the app's guidance. The driver politely declined. Angela became increasingly agitated, raising her voice and accusing him of intentionally delaying her trip. The driver remained calm and continued in the center lane. Angela unbuckled her seatbelt and leaned forward between the front seats, pointing at the navigation screen and demanding he change routes. The driver told her to sit back and refasten her seatbelt. She refused. Without warning, Angela reached over the driver's right shoulder and grabbed the steering wheel with both hands. She pulled it sharply to the right, attempting to force the car toward the exit. The driver immediately tried to regain control, pulling the wheel back while taking his foot off the accelerator. The car swerved into the right lane as a sedan braked and honked. The driver overcorrected, sending the vehicle back toward the center lane while he fought for control. Angela continued gripping the wheel, forcing it right again and pushing the car sharply toward the shoulder. The car's right front tire caught the edge where pavement met the raised shoulder. At approximately 55 miles per hour, the vehicle veered onto the shoulder. The driver attempted to straighten the wheel, but Angela's grip prevented correction. The car traveled approximately 40 feet along the shoulder before the right tires hit loose gravel. The vehicle became unstable and began rotating clockwise. Angela was thrown forward into the front cabin area as the car spun. The vehicle rotated approximately 120 degrees, and the passenger side struck a concrete support pillar at approximately 45 miles per hour. The impact crushed the rear passenger compartment where Angela's body was positioned. The driver was restrained by his seatbelt and deployed airbag. Angela was motionless, pinned between the front and back seats. Multiple witnesses stopped and called emergency services. First responders arrived within 8 minutes. The driver suffered a concussion, fractured ribs, and lacerations. Angela was unresponsive and trapped in the wreckage. Extraction took 22 minutes. She was transported to a medical facility but pronounced dead en route. The cause of death was massive internal injuries and severe thoracic trauma from the impact. Dash cam footage clearly showed Angela grabbing the steering wheel and causing the loss of control. Her seatbelt was unbuckled at the time of the crash. The case was ruled an accidental death, with Angela's actions determined to be the direct cause. The rideshare driver was not charged and cleared of any wrongdoing.
It was August 11th, 2018, and cool morning air carried a strong hydrogen sulfide odor across a geothermal field outside Reykjavik, Iceland. Steam rose from vents scattered across the barren volcanic landscape. Wooden boardwalks connected viewing platforms above active hot springs with rope barriers and warning signs marking designated safe pathways. Mirelle Ashford was 56 years old and owned an art gallery in Charleston, specializing in contemporary sculpture. She had traveled to Iceland with her husband for a 10-day landscape tour. Her husband later described her as intellectually condescending and dismissive of guides, often mocking organized tourism. They joined a small guided tour of the geothermal area. The group of 9 tourists was accompanied by a licensed guide with over 8 years of experience. The tour company operated under permits requiring visitors to remain on designated boardwalks. Before entry, the guide conducted a safety briefing, explaining that visible hot springs were fed by superheated groundwater with temperatures near boiling. He emphasized that the surrounding ground was unstable, consisting of thin crust layers covering scalding water and mud just inches below the surface. Rope barriers marked surveyed safe zones, while areas beyond contained unassessed vents capable of causing severe burns within seconds. As the group moved along the boardwalk, Mirelle repeatedly interrupted, stating the tour felt overly cautious and that barriers limited access to more interesting features. They stopped at a viewing platform overlooking a vivid blue pool ringed with white mineral deposits. Steam rose steadily from its surface. The platform stood about 15 feet back, separated by rope barriers and warning signs. The guide explained the pool's color resulted from suspended silica particles and reiterated that the ground beyond the barrier was unstable. Mirelle complained that the experience did not match promotional materials and said she had paid for authenticity, not to stand behind ropes. The guide repeated that the restrictions were mandatory. While the guide answered questions from other tourists, Morel walked along the boardwalk toward a section where the rope barrier was secured to a wooden post about 30 feet away. Her husband called after her. She paused, looked back at the guide, and stepped over the rope onto bare ground. Her husband shouted immediately. The guide ran toward her, ordering her to step back. Morel ignored him and walked slowly toward white, crusted earth that appeared solid, holding up her phone and narrating that she was accessing restricted areas. After approximately 20 feet, the ground beneath her right foot collapsed. Her leg plunged into scalding mud before she fell forward, breaking through the fragile crust with her hands and left leg. The surface gave way further, dropping her into a shallow depression filled with superheated mud and water. Her cries were immediate. The guide stopped at the barrier edge, radioing emergency services as steam rose from vents between his position and Morel, making a direct rescue unsafe. She attempted to push herself up, but sank deeper as the surrounding crust continued to crumble. When her husband moved toward the barrier, the guide restrained him, explaining specialized equipment was required. Geothermal rescue personnel arrived within 19 minutes, using rigid boards to distribute weight. They extracted Morel, who remained conscious but in severe distress. Her clothing was badly damaged by heat and mineral-rich water, and extensive burns covered her legs, arms, hands, and portions of her torso. A medical helicopter transported her to a hospital in Reykjavik. Despite aggressive burn management, her condition deteriorated over the next 16 hours, progressing to multi-organ failure. She was pronounced dead the following morning. Post-mortem findings determined that death resulted from multi-organ system failure, secondary to severe thermal burns covering approximately 40% of her body's surface area. Authorities concluded the tour company followed required safety protocols and that the guide's actions were appropriate. Video recovered from Morel's phone documented her barrier violation and the guide's warnings. Additional signage and higher barriers were later installed at the site. It was March 18, 2016, at a suburban shopping center in central Ohio, where weekend shoppers moved between floors beneath glass ceilings. Zelda Quigg, 41, worked in an office environment and had a habit of ignoring posted safety rules when she believed they were unnecessary. She navigated the busy corridors, pushing a metal grocery cart with her 6-year-old child seated comfortably inside, having filled it with their weekly shopping haul, weighing approximately 40 pounds. Approaching the downward escalator leading to the parking level, Zelda encountered prominent yellow warning signs prohibiting shopping carts and strollers on the moving stairs. The signs clearly directed customers with wheeled items to use the elevator located just 30 feet away, where other shoppers were already using the alternative route. A middle-aged woman nearby noticed Zelda positioning her loaded cart at the escalator entrance and warned her, pointing to the posted signs and gesturing toward the nearby elevator. Zelda waved off the concern and continued forward, appearing annoyed by the interruption and confident that the rules did not apply to her. As Zelda attempted to guide the cart onto the moving steps, the front wheels initially rolled onto the first step successfully. Within seconds, however, the rear wheels caught firmly against the metal comb plate at the escalator entrance. This mechanical resistance caused the heavy cart to twist violently sideways across the full width of the moving staircase. The sudden rotation threw her child forward from their seated position, sending them tumbling onto the escalator steps below. Zelda instinctively lunged forward to help, but the twisted cart now created an unstable barrier. She fell chest first across the metal frame, her upper body striking the cart's edge with considerable force. The escalator's downward motion kept pressing the twisted cart forward, driving Zelda's upper body against the side panel as the steps continued to move beneath her. Her head and chest were pinned briefly between the cart's metal frame and the escalator side panel, while her body was dragged several steps before the motion could be stopped. Witnesses later reported that her head struck the metal edge of the escalator housing during the struggle. Nearby shoppers stood frozen momentarily in shock before anyone reacted. After approximately 7 seconds, multiple witnesses rushed to activate the emergency stop button, bringing the escalator to an abrupt halt. By the time the escalator stopped, Zelda was slumped across the cart and not responding to those calling her name, showing only shallow, irregular breathing. Emergency medical responders arrived within minutes, working carefully to extract both victims from the escalator mechanism. Paramedics immediately assessed Zelda's condition, but could detect no signs of life. She was pronounced dead at the scene despite their efforts. Security personnel cordoned off the area while investigators documented the scene. The subsequent medical examination determined that Zelda had suffered severe blunt force trauma to the head and upper chest, along with crushing injuries caused by being pinned against the escalator structure. The medical examiner concluded that the combination of head impact and chest compression led to rapid loss of consciousness and cardiac arrest. Her child survived the fall with only minor injuries, requiring basic medical treatment at a nearby hospital. Mall security provided surveillance footage that clearly documented the entire sequence of events from multiple angles. Local authorities confirmed that the escalator had been operating normally and that all emergency stop systems functioned as designed when activated by witnesses. The final investigation concluded that the fatality resulted directly from equipment misuse, despite clearly posted safety guidelines and the immediate availability of safe alternatives. It was September 2015, and the dense canopy of a West Virginia state forest filtered the late morning sunlight into scattered patches on the forest floor. The air carried the earthy scent of decomposing leaves and damp soil, typical of the region's humid autumn climate. A well-maintained trail wound through towering oak and maple trees, marked with occasional wooden signs warning hikers about various forest hazards. Delilah Frey, a 52-year-old online reseller who specialized in natural products, had joined a small hiking group exploring the area's diverse ecosystem. Her dismissive attitude toward authority and argumentative nature had already created tension with the volunteer trail guide. Delilah prided herself on her self-taught knowledge of wilderness survival, gleaned primarily from internet forums and amateur foraging websites. The group had stopped near a rotting log approximately 3 miles from the trailhead when Delilah spotted a cluster of white-capped mushrooms growing in the rich soil. The volunteer guide immediately cautioned against touching any wild fungi, pointing to posted warnings about toxic species common to the area. Delilah scoffed at the advice, accusing the guide of unnecessary fear-mongering and claiming that mainstream experts deliberately suppressed traditional foraging knowledge. Despite multiple warnings from both the guide and other hikers, Delilah picked one of the larger specimens and examined it closely. She insisted her online research had taught her to identify edible varieties, dismissing the guide's formal training in mycology and years of field experience. The mushroom appeared pristine, with a clean white cap and sturdy stem that matched descriptions from various foraging websites she considered authoritative. Despite the warnings, Delilah broke off a large portion of the mushroom and ate it raw, insisting that a small sample posed no risk, chewing it thoroughly while maintaining eye contact with the concerned guide. She refused suggestions to seek immediate medical attention, claiming that her body could handle any mild digestive upset. The group reluctantly continued their hike, with several members expressing discomfort. The initial hours passed without incident as the group completed their planned route and returned to the parking area. Delilah showed no immediate symptoms and appeared vindicated. However, approximately 8 to 12 hours after ingestion, severe gastrointestinal distress began late that evening. Violent vomiting and diarrhea forced her to pull over multiple times during her drive home. The symptoms intensified throughout the night, but Delilah experienced a temporary improvement the following morning that gave her false hope. This brief respite masked the progressive liver damage occurring internally. By the second day, her condition deteriorated rapidly, as organ failure accelerated. Family members found Delilah disoriented and jaundiced in her home and immediately transported her to a small rural emergency department. By the second day, she became increasingly confused as hepatic encephalopathy set in, followed by seizures as her liver function collapsed. The small rural facility lacked specialized equipment for advanced toxicology treatment. Despite emergency efforts to stabilize her condition, Delilah suffered cardiac arrest within 48 to 72 hours of consuming the mushroom. Resuscitation attempts failed, and she was pronounced dead at the clinic. The rapid progression from apparent recovery to complete organ failure followed the classic pattern of severe mushroom poisoning. Subsequent toxicological analysis confirmed the presence of amatoxins, deadly compounds found in several wild mushroom species native to West Virginia forests. Investigators documented witness statements from the hiking group, including the volunteer guide's warnings and Delilah's deliberate consumption despite posted safety notices. The medical examiner ruled the death accidental poisoning, emphasizing that the victim had ignored multiple warnings from qualified personnel.
It was June 14th, 2015, a Sunday, and the temperature in Lakewood, Ohio had reached 91 degrees by early afternoon. The community pool was open, occupied, and operating normally. Nothing about the day suggested a disruption beyond routine summer use. Deborah Foss, 54, had lived in the development for over 20 years and worked part-time at a local retail store. She held no HOA role, but frequently inserted herself into enforcement issues, filing 31 complaints in 18 months, none upheld. Residents described her as confrontational and controlling overshared spaces. She had mild hypertension, chronic plantar fasciitis, wore orthopedic sandals, and lived alone. The Washington family had moved in 8 months earlier. Renan, 38, was an electrician, and Nathania, 36, worked part-time at a pediatric clinic. They had 3 children, including 15-year-old Aliyah. Their dues were current, with full access to amenities. Deborah filed 4 complaints against them, none upheld. Aliyah began recording after repeated confrontations initiated by Deborah. The family arrived at the pool carrying towels and a cooler. Deborah was already seated near the entrance with a printed copy of the association bylaws, positioned to monitor entry. The pool was below its posted capacity. As the family approached, she stood immediately and moved to block the gate, placing herself directly in front of the latch. Without any authority, she told Renan that access needed to be confirmed and that the pool was at capacity. I didn't think much at first, but she got up so fast it felt like she'd been waiting for them, like the paper in her hand was already ready before they even reached the gate. Renan presented a valid membership card. Deborah examined it briefly and stated it appeared expired. She did not step aside. Instead, she remained fixed in place, continuing to assert control over entry. Other residents began watching. Deborah's voice grew louder as she repeated her claims, speaking over responses and preventing the situation from settling. Her posture became rigid. She maintained her position at the gate, using her body as a barrier. Renan remained measured and stated they were entering. When he reached toward the latch, Deborah reacted immediately, stepping forward and shoving him with both hands to the chest. The action was abrupt and not in response to any physical threat. Renan stepped backward onto the grass and maintained balance. He did not respond physically. Deborah remained at the gate, now standing on the narrow concrete drainage edge outside the entrance. The surface was wet from pool runoff and had a thin layer of algae. Her movement during the shove had shifted her weight forward beyond stable footing. Her left foot slipped outward, and her right foot failed to gain traction. Her body tilted backward. She was still holding the printed bylaws in one hand and did not reposition to break the fall. The back of her head struck the rounded edge of the pool, coping with significant force. Her body continued into the water face down. She did not attempt to recover or surface. Within seconds, the water around her head began to discolor. At first, it just looked like she slipped under normally until the stillness in her body made it clear something was wrong. Renan entered the pool and lifted her, keeping her face above water while calling for help. A lifeguard reached them shortly after, and assisted in bringing her to the deck. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation was initiated. Aaliyah continued recording as bystanders moved back. Emergency responders arrived and continued advanced care. Deborah was transported without regaining consciousness and was later pronounced dead. The cause of death was blunt force traumatic brain injury. The impact created a depressed fracture at the back of the skull, driving bone fragments into critical brain structures and causing immediate loss of consciousness and breathing. She was non-viable before entering the water, with drowning considered secondary. The wet surface and low traction from her footwear also contributed to the outcome. For privacy, the recording was removed from circulation. The Homeowners Association later reached a settlement with the Washington family over the handling of repeated complaints and ongoing disputes. The pool entrance was updated with a non-slip surface, and signage was added indicating all residents were permitted access.
It was July 11th, 2018. The morning sun cast long shadows across the glass facade of the luxury high-rise in downtown Miami as Barbara Flint stood on her 42nd floor balcony, surveying the streaked windows that had been bothering her for months. Barbara had built her reputation as the building's most notorious holdout, a retired insurance adjuster who had purchased her corner unit in 2009. She viewed any shared expense as an assault on individual property rights. Previous colleagues said that her background in claims investigation had made her naturally suspicious of contractors and service providers, leading her to challenge every building expense from elevator maintenance to landscaping. High-rise window cleaning demands specialized training and equipment to manage extreme winds and height risks. Professional crews rely on industrial harnesses, redundant safety systems, and weather monitoring. Despite repeated warnings from the building management about safety and insurance liability, Barbara dismissed them as corporate fear-mongering to justify costly service contracts. That morning, Barbara set up a self-devised safety system using second-hand climbing gear she had bought online 5 years earlier, including a harness, carabiners, and static rope stored in a humid unit without proper inspection. Despite high wind advisories for Miami, with gusts up to 35 miles per hour by midday, she was determined to finish before the building's cleaning crew arrived. Barbara planned to anchor herself to the balcony railing and lean outward with an extended squeegee, mistakenly treating the railing as a load-rated anchor. Security footage showed her testing the rope and carabiners, but she likely lacked understanding of fall forces or equipment inspection. Despite her inexperience, she proceeded confidently while preparing her cleaning supplies. Barbara stepped over the balcony railing and began cleaning the first window panel. The building's security cameras captured her preparation and movements from angles covering the balcony and immediate exterior, though much of her lateral motion across the building was only partially visible as she worked her way across the building's exterior. Her movements became tentatively more confident with each window, though unsteady compared with a trained professional. The wind had been steadily increasing throughout the morning, creating additional stress on her improvised anchor system that she failed to recognize or account for. As Barbara leaned outward to reach a particularly stubborn streak on the glass, the primary carabiner connecting her harness to the anchor rope failed catastrophically due to corrosion and improper cross-loading under the combined forces of her body weight and the wind load. Barbara plummeted immediately, her body striking 3 lower balconies before impacting the concrete courtyard after approximately 5 seconds of fall time over 400 feet below. Multiple residents witnessed the fall and immediately called emergency services. The first responders arrived within 8 minutes, but Barbara's injuries were incompatible with life. The building's security director had watched the entire incident unfold on the monitoring system and provided detailed footage to investigators, but wasn't released publicly. The courtyard area was immediately cordoned off as emergency crews worked to secure the scene. The medical examiner determined that Barbara died from massive blunt force trauma, including multiple skull fractures, complete spinal cord transection, and catastrophic internal organ damage. The impact had been instantaneous and unsurvivable. The building's management company implemented mandatory safety compliance inspections following Barbara's death, prohibiting residents from performing exterior maintenance work. Her estate was subsequently billed for 3 years of unpaid maintenance fees, which were deducted from the proceeds of her unit sale to cover the building's legal and cleanup costs.
It was March 14th, 2015, in Portland, Oregon. Rain misted the streets as the city came to life. A multi-story renovation project had been underway for 3 weeks in a mixed commercial district. Marla Dennison, 41, owned a boutique 2 buildings down from the construction site and had built the business from scratch over 6 years. She took pride in creating a calm, upscale atmosphere for her customers and viewed the construction as a personal attack on her livelihood. For weeks, she had complained about the noise disrupting her customers. She left aggressive written complaints taped to the fence and had confronted workers during breaks, calling them inconsiderate and unprofessional. That morning, after particularly loud jackhammer noise, she told her assistant she was going to handle it herself, since no one took her seriously. Around 10:20 a.m., Marla closed her store temporarily and walked toward the construction site. She wore business casual clothing and carried her phone. Witnesses later reported she appeared agitated and was looking up at the building as she approached. The entrance gate was partially open where a delivery truck had just exited. A worker near the gate was occupied with paperwork and had his back turned. Marla had no construction experience and no hard hat or safety vest. The site's active work zones included overhead crane operations, and loads were being moved across the upper floors at irregular intervals. Marla walked past the open gate without announcing herself or waiting for clearance. She moved approximately 40 feet into the site, navigating around stacked materials and equipment. Her focus remained upward, toward the source of the noise on the 3rd floor. A crane operator on the 4th floor was repositioning a load of steel I-beams bundled together, weighing roughly 600 pounds. The load was being moved horizontally across the building's exterior before being lowered to the ground-level staging area. The operator had a limited view of the ground directly below due to the angle and building structure. Marla stopped in the center of the staging area, still looking upward. She raised her phone, appearing to record or photograph the work above. A ground crew member approximately 50 feet away noticed her and began moving in her direction, waving his arms. The crane load swung slightly as it cleared the building edge, a normal movement during repositioning. The operator began the descent, following the planned path to the staging area. The load was approximately 30 feet above ground when it entered Marla's vicinity. The ground crew member shouted, but machinery noise masked his voice. Marla remained stationary, looking at the wrong floor. The beams descended at approximately 2 feet per second. At 15 feet above ground, the load entered Marla's peripheral vision. She looked up and stepped backward instead of moving laterally. The beams struck her head and upper body directly. She collapsed immediately under the weight and did not move. Work stopped within seconds. The ground crew reached her within 30 seconds and lifted the beams, but she was unresponsive with severe visible trauma. Emergency services arrived within 7 minutes and pronounced her dead at the scene. The cause of death was massive blunt force trauma to the head and chest, with skull fracture and crushing injuries. Investigators reviewed safety protocols, crane logs, and witness statements. Security footage confirmed Marla had entered without authorization into a clearly marked active work zone. The case was ruled an accidental death caused by unauthorized entry. The construction company was in compliance with safety regulations, but implemented additional gate security measures. Marla's family did not pursue legal action.
It was January 6th, 2020, when late morning sun warmed white sand on a Queensland beach in northern Australia. The temperature approached 95 degrees. Turquoise water stretched toward a barrier reef, visible miles offshore. About 30 beachgoers gathered near a patrolled swimming zone marked by red and yellow flags. Kendrix Valance was 39 years old and worked as a personal fitness trainer in Seattle, operating a small studio. She was vacationing in Australia with her boyfriend, who later described her as supremely confident in her physical abilities and dismissive of safety warnings she viewed as exaggerated. They arrived around 10:30 at a beach monitored by volunteer surf lifesavers. Large signs at the entrance and patrol station warned that marine stingers were present due to seasonal conditions and that swimming was not recommended outside a small netted enclosure. The warnings specifically mentioned box jellyfish and irukandji jellyfish, both potentially fatal. Kendricks read the signs and remarked that the warnings were meant to scare tourists. She said she had swum in tropical waters throughout Southeast Asia without incident, and that jellyfish stings were rarely serious. When her boyfriend suggested using the netted area, Kendricks said it looked crowded and unappealing. They set up towels roughly 200 feet south of the patrol station. As Kendricks walked toward the water outside the flagged zone, a surf lifesaver called out, instructing her to swim inside the designated area due to stinger risk. When she replied that she was an experienced swimmer, the lifesaver explained that box jellyfish had been sighted recently and that multiple stings had been reported over the previous week. He stated that patrol policy required directing swimmers back to shore during dangerous conditions. Kendricks became confrontational, saying she did not need supervision. She pulled out her phone and began recording, accusing the lifesaver of harassment. Other beachgoers paused to watch as the lifesaver calmly reiterated that box jellyfish stings could be fatal and that the netted enclosure was the only cleared area. Kendricks laughed, dismissed the warning, and said she would swim where she chose. The lifesaver radioed for backup and followed at a distance as Kendricks waded in and began swimming parallel to the beach, moving away from the netted zone against a light lateral current. Her boyfriend remained on shore. After several minutes, covering roughly 70 yards, Kendricks' swimming motion changed abruptly. She stopped making forward progress, her body stiffening before she began thrashing at the surface. Cries of distress were audible from shore, and 2 lifesavers entered the water immediately. They reached her within 90 seconds. Kendricks was floating face up, breathing rapidly, with extensive linear welts visible across her torso, arms, and legs, consistent with jellyfish tentacle contact. She was semi-conscious, moaning in pain, and unable to coordinate her movements. The lifesavers supported her and brought her to shore while radioing for vinegar. On the sand, vinegar was applied to inactivate remaining nematocysts. Welts covered roughly 30% of her upper body. Kendricks remained conscious but in severe distress, with rapid breathing and a markedly elevated heart rate. Emergency responders arrived within 12 minutes and initiated advanced life support. During transport to the nearest tertiary hospital, approximately 45 minutes away, Kendricks developed cardiac arrhythmias consistent with the cardiotoxic effects of box jellyfish venom. Despite antivenom administration and aggressive supportive care, Kendricks suffered complete cardiovascular collapse about 2 hours after the sting. Resuscitation attempts were unsuccessful, and she was pronounced dead. Coronial findings determined that death resulted from cardiac arrest, secondary to severe box jellyfish envenomation. Forensic analysis identified venom consistent with Chironex fleckeri, with sting patterns indicating contact across a large body surface area. Investigators concluded surf lifesavers followed proper protocols and that Kendricks had been repeatedly warned. Queensland authorities made no procedural changes, and the case was later incorporated into lifesaver training materials. It was November 6, 2017, at a busy rail crossing in Newark, New Jersey, where residential streets met active freight tracks and weekday commuters gathered during the height of the morning rush. 29-year-old Sloan Mercer worked in retail management, supervising staff at a downtown clothing store. Known for her impatience and confrontational approach to obstacles, she was running late for her opening shift that Tuesday morning. She hurried along crowded sidewalks toward the crossing, aware that arriving late meant delaying store operations and explaining herself to supervisors who expected strict punctuality. The crossing arms had already descended across the roadway, red warning lights flashing in synchronized patterns. The familiar sound of train horns echoed through the urban landscape as the approaching locomotive announced its presence to anyone within hearing distance. Safety protocols were functioning exactly as designed, creating multiple layers of warning for pedestrians and vehicles. Other pedestrians gathered at the intersection, accepting the inevitable delay that comes with urban rail transportation. The crossing barriers created a clear physical boundary, supported by posted warning signs and active audio-visual alerts. Standard safety equipment had been recently inspected and certified by transportation authorities. Several witnesses later reported observing her pacing impatiently and muttering angrily while waiting behind the lowered barrier. Sloan observed the scene with growing frustration. Her confrontational nature emerged as she calculated the time being lost to her morning schedule. Rather than wait with the other pedestrians, she made the decision to circumvent the safety barriers and attempt to cross the active rail line before the approaching train reached the intersection. She stepped around the lowered crossing arm and began sprinting across the multiple sets of tracks. The distance appeared manageable, and her pace seemed adequate for clearing the rails before the locomotive arrived. However, halfway across the crossing, her foot caught in the flangeway gap between the rail and the pavement, a narrow groove that guides train wheels through the crossing. The unexpected obstacle caused her to stumble forward, losing her balance and falling directly into the path of the oncoming train. The locomotive struck her midsection with devastating force, the impact causing catastrophic blunt force injuries. The massive weight and momentum of the freight train made survival impossible from the moment of contact. The locomotive operator immediately applied emergency braking procedures, bringing the train to a stop approximately a quarter-mile down the track. Emergency responders arrived within minutes of the impact, but Sloan was pronounced dead at the scene. The severity of the injuries left no possibility for medical intervention. Transportation authorities conducted a thorough investigation of the incident. Their official report confirmed that all safety systems had been functioning properly at the time of the collision. The crossing arms, warning lights, and audio signals had activated according to standard protocols. The locomotive operator had followed all required safety procedures, including the sounding of warning horns at appropriate distances from the crossing. Multiple pedestrian witnesses provided consistent accounts confirming the victim had deliberately bypassed the active safety barriers. Security camera footage from nearby businesses corroborated witness statements about the sequence of events. The final report documented that the victim had deliberately bypassed active safety barriers and entered the rail crossing against clearly posted warnings and visible safety equipment. It was October 20th, 2018, in a residential subdivision in Mesa, Arizona. The late afternoon desert sun cast long shadows between the uniform houses as temperatures eased from the day's peak heat. The quiet neighborhood streets were lined with manicured lawns and carefully maintained driveways, where the soft ticking of cooling engines and the hiss of sprinkler systems filled the background. A licensed drone contractor was conducting a limited pilot delivery test in coordination with a regional retail partner. The aircraft descended to approximately 20 feet above a concrete driveway as part of a controlled demonstration approved for the neighborhood. The operator maintained visual line of sight while preparing to complete the programmed release sequence under temporary FAA authorization. 56-year-old Nancy Quab emerged from her adjacent property, immediately confronting the operator about what she believed was unauthorized surveillance. Nancy served on the local homeowners association board and had developed a reputation for aggressively policing neighborhood activity. Her confrontational approach to perceived violations had created ongoing friction with residents and service providers. Nancy had previously filed multiple complaints regarding delivery trucks, landscaping crews, and what she described as aerial spying. She often recorded interactions on her phone, convinced documentation would validate her position in formal disputes. Minor disagreements frequently escalated under her watch. As the drone hovered over the designated drop zone, Nancy grabbed a metal rake from beside her garage and advanced toward the driveway. Several neighbors began filming from doorways and windows as her raised voice echoed across the street. The operator moved to maintain distance as the aircraft continued operating lawfully, with the spinning rotors posing a clear safety risk. Despite the visible blades and loud rotor noise, Nancy swung the rake upward into the rotor assembly. The strike shattered a propeller and disrupted the drone's stabilization. The aircraft lurched sideways, clipped the edge of the driveway and slammed down hard on the concrete. The impact cracked the outer casing and damaged the lithium battery pack. Shortly after impact, the damaged battery pack began venting white-gray smoke. A brief flare ignited at the fracture point, remaining confined to the damaged battery housing as it discharged. The flames remained concentrated around the wreckage rather than spreading outward. Startled by the sudden burst of heat and smoke, Nancy stepped backward quickly. Her heel caught on the slight lip where the driveway met the garage slab. Off balance and already leaning away from the smoke, she fell straight back. Witness videos, later reviewed by investigators, showed her head striking the concrete without her arms breaking the fall. The impact was clearly audible on multiple recordings. The drone fire continued to burn in a contained pool of flame a few feet away, gradually diminishing as the battery exhausted itself. The operator called emergency services while keeping bystanders clear of the smoking debris. A neighbor used a garden hose to cool the wreckage once the flames subsided. Nancy remained unresponsive on the driveway. Paramedics arrived approximately 9 minutes after the 911 call and initiated advanced life support. According to the medical examiner's findings, she sustained a severe occipital skull fracture with associated intracranial bleeding. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The death was ruled accidental, caused by blunt force trauma sustained during a backward fall. Investigators confirmed through multiple witness recordings that Nancy had initiated physical contact with the aircraft, and the operator was found to be compliant with federal and local regulations.
It was August 9, 2016, and a domestic flight was still at the gate at a major airport. The aircraft had not pushed back, and boarding was still being finalized. The cabin was stationary, with passengers settling into their seats and overhead bins still in use. Nothing about the situation had yet transitioned into flight operations. Gail Murchison, 55, worked in real estate in Aurora, Colorado. She had been licensed for over a decade and operated a small independent practice with modest sales performance. She traveled infrequently by air and had booked a middle seat assignment in row 22 for a business-related trip to Orlando. She had consumed alcohol before boarding at the terminal and was traveling alone. Seat 22F, the window seat in that row, was assigned to Noah Castillo, a 9-year-old child traveling alone to visit family. His seat assignment had been confirmed in advance, including the window position requested due to motion sensitivity. He wore an identification lanyard indicating he was traveling alone and was escorted during boarding. Gail boarded and proceeded to row 22, where she found the window seat unoccupied and sat there instead of her assigned middle seat. She stored her belongings and remained seated. When Noah arrived with a gate escort and identified his seat, he stated that he believed the window seat was his. Gail did not acknowledge the clarification and instructed him to sit in the middle seat instead. The escort explained that the assignment was fixed and that the child was traveling alone. Gail refused to move and insisted the seating arrangement did not concern her. The child became visibly distressed and remained standing in the aisle as the situation stalled. A flight attendant was called to the row and reiterated that the seat assignment had to be followed. Gail continued to refuse, stating she had paid for her ticket and would not relocate. Her tone escalated, and she remained seated in the incorrect seat while the conflict continued. This is the point where you can feel the entire row starting to tighten up around what's happening. As the interaction progressed, Gail stood up into the aisle, not to comply, but to continue arguing. She stepped toward the crew member and made contact with their lanyard, pulling it forward during the exchange. The action caused a brief loss of balance before recovery against the seat armrest. The situation escalated further in the confined aisle space, with passengers observing from nearby rows. As the interaction continued, Gail turned away from the crew member and reached upward toward the overhead compartment above her row, pulling at the latch while still speaking. The compartment door released and swung downward in its standard motion, but her position directly beneath it left no space to avoid it. The edge of the door struck the side of her head at close range. The impact disrupted her balance in the narrow aisle, and she fell sideways, striking the armrest before her head hit the floor. The secondary impact was direct and unbroken. She did not regain responsiveness. Crew members initiated an emergency response while medical personnel on board assisted within moments. She was found unconscious with abnormal pupil response and signs consistent with severe head trauma. The aircraft remained at the gate while emergency services were requested. She was transported for advanced medical treatment. In situations like this, everything shifts into procedure mode, even while the cabin is still full of people watching in silence. Medical evaluation identified a severe intracranial bleed caused by blunt force trauma sustained during the fall, primarily from impact with the armrest and floor. The impact resulted in a fractured bone and damage to a major artery beneath the skull, causing rapid internal pressure on the brain. Despite surgical intervention to relieve the pressure and remove the blood clot, the brain injury had already progressed to irreversible damage. She later died from complications related to the injury. The cause of death was determined to be acute epidural hematoma resulting from blunt force head trauma. The manner of death was classified as accidental. The outcome was influenced by the location of impact on a structurally vulnerable area of the skull and the rapid onset of intracranial bleeding. The passenger who opened the overhead compartment was questioned and cleared of wrongdoing. Airline personnel had followed standard boarding and seating procedures, and the seating conflict was identified as the initiating factor in the sequence of events. The child was later rebooked and continued his travel.
It was February 6, 2015. The evening air in Orlando, Florida hung thick with humidity, clinging to the asphalt and the rows of parked cars outside an elementary school. Patricia Mendoza sat in her silver sedan, the engine idling, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the steering wheel. Her face was flushed from rage after the volatile school board meeting that had just ended, where heated arguments and pointed accusations had left the room tense and silent in turns. Patricia had built her reputation as the most feared parent advocate in Orange County's school system. A former marketing executive turned full-time activist, she had dedicated the last 8 years to what she called educational accountability. She had confrontations with school administrators, teachers, and other parents she deemed inadequate. Local education officials knew her well. She had successfully lobbied for traffic pattern changes around 3 schools, always citing child safety while targeting families she personally disliked. Patricia's methods were calculated and ruthless. Her laptop contained detailed files on dozens of parents, noting everything from divorce proceedings to financial troubles. That evening's board meeting had been particularly volatile. She had publicly accused a single mother of neglecting her learning-disabled son, presenting printed screenshots of the woman's social media account posts as evidence of poor parenting. The woman had fled the meeting in tears, while Patricia demanded the school investigate the family's home situation. Security eventually escorted her from the building. Patricia stormed through the school parking lot. She had successfully forced 2 families to transfer their children to different schools through similar campaigns, and this case would be her most public victory. At 7:43 in the evening, well outside active school hours, Patricia pulled out of the school parking lot while simultaneously typing a text message to one of her friends about the incident. Traffic cameras captured her sedan accelerating through the very school zone she had lobbied to expand. Her phone was later confirmed as visible in multiple frames after enhancement of nearby intersection camera footage as she approached the intersection of Colonial Drive and Semoran Boulevard. The light had been red for 8 seconds when her vehicle entered the intersection at approximately 47 miles per hour, never slowing down. Immediately, a delivery truck struck Patricia's sedan on the driver's side with devastating force, crushing the cabin and spinning the vehicle before it came to rest against a traffic signal pole. The truck driver immediately called 911 while several witnesses rushed to the wreckage, but the driver's door was completely compressed, making rescue impossible. Patricia's phone was found on the passenger floor, still displaying the half-finished text message she had been typing when she ran the red light. Emergency responders arrived within 6 minutes, but Patricia had already succumbed to her injuries. The medical examiner determined she died from massive chest trauma, internal bleeding, and complete spinal cord transection caused by blunt force crushing. Her dash cam footage, which survived the side impact despite partial damage, showed her looking down at her phone for the final 12 seconds before impact, completely oblivious to the red light ahead. The school district implemented new conduct policies for public meetings following Patricia's death. Her 2 teenage children were placed with relatives who later, according to court filings and family statements, revealed the toxic environment Patricia had created at home, where she had trained them to spy on classmates' families for her campaigns.
It was January 19, 2014, in Atlanta, Georgia. Gray clouds hung low over the city as temperatures dropped. A 14-story office building in the downtown business district housed multiple companies and saw heavy weekday traffic. Lorraine Vickers was 46 years old and worked on the 12th floor as an office manager. She had been with the company for 8 years and was familiar with the building's layout. She was known for frequently complaining to building management about various inconveniences, including the temperature controls, parking assignments, and what she considered unnecessary fire drills. She had previously sent multiple emails demanding the company provide special accommodations for her during evacuations due to her knee problems, insisting she shouldn't be expected to use stairs like everyone else. She often reminded coworkers that she had seniority and certain standards she expected the building to meet. On this day, she was preparing to leave when the fire alarm sounded. Lorraine's coworkers immediately moved toward the stairwell, but she stopped and rolled her eyes. As others filed past, she loudly commented that the alarm was probably another drill and that she refused to walk down 12 flights of stairs for nothing. A coworker urged her to come along, but Lorraine waved her off dismissively and walked toward the elevator bank instead. Lorraine pressed the elevator call button repeatedly. Another coworker passing by told her the elevators were disabled and urged her to use the stairs. Lorraine snapped that she knew what she was doing and continued pressing the button. After approximately 2 minutes, one elevator began ascending. A sensor malfunction in the recall system had prevented this particular unit from fully shutting down. The elevator stopped at the 12th floor and the doors opened. Lorraine stepped inside with her belongings and pressed the button for the ground floor. The doors closed and the elevator began descending. Smoke from the 9th floor fire spread through the corridor and began seeping into the elevator shaft through gaps around the doors and ventilation openings. The elevator descended past the 11th floor normally. Between the 10th and 9th floors, smoke density increased significantly in the shaft. As conditions in the shaft worsened, the elevator's safety system triggered an emergency stop, leaving the car halted between floors near the 9th level, where the fire was burning. The doors did not open. Lorraine was trapped inside. Smoke began entering the cabin through door seams and the ceiling ventilation panel at an increasing rate. The emergency call button connected her to building security. Her voice was recorded asking for help and stating she could not breathe. The call lasted approximately 90 seconds before she stopped responding. Fire crews arrived within 5 minutes of the alarm. They accessed the elevator shaft from the 9th floor and forced open the doors within 14 minutes of Lorraine entering. She was found unconscious on the floor, surrounded by dense smoke. Lorraine was removed and brought to ground level. Paramedics administered oxygen and attempted resuscitation, but she did not regain consciousness. She was transported to a medical facility and pronounced dead approximately 40 minutes after arrival. The cause of death was smoke inhalation leading to asphyxiation, with critically elevated carbon monoxide levels in her bloodstream. The 9th floor fire had been contained quickly, but smoke had spread rapidly through the elevator shaft. Investigators determined Lorraine had entered an elevator that should have been locked out due to a sensor malfunction. Her decision to use the elevator during an active fire alarm was cited as the primary contributing factor. The building management replaced the entire elevator recall system and installed additional visual warning systems at elevator banks during fire alarms.
It was July 14, 2016, and humid afternoon air hung over a private villa spa in Ubud, Bali. Steam rose from heated stones on bamboo shelves as eucalyptus oil drifted through open pavilion walls. Palm fronds rustled above the treatment room. Bryn Castleman was 42 years old and worked as a regional vice president for a pharmaceutical sales company in Chicago. She had traveled to Bali with 2 friends for a wellness retreat. Friends later described her as dismissive toward service workers and someone who believed her professional status entitled her to special treatment. The spa offered a traditional deep tissue treatment using heated stones and sustained pressure. The service required health screening, as prolonged heat and intensive manipulation carried risks for individuals with cardiovascular conditions or those taking blood pressure or anticoagulant medications. The intake form asked about recent heart procedures, prescriptions, and medical history. Bryn had undergone cardiac catheterization 4 months earlier and took anticoagulant medication daily. She left the cardiovascular section blank and marked no beside questions related to heart conditions and recent procedures. The spa technician reviewed the form and began verbal screening, asking directly about heart conditions and recent medical interventions. Bryn interrupted, stating the questions were unnecessary. The technician explained that the treatment involved sustained heat that could affect circulation, making certain conditions unsafe. Bryn raised her voice, asking if she was being accused of lying. She pulled out her phone and began recording, stating loudly that she was being refused service after paying premium rates. She demanded a manager and threatened negative reviews on multiple platforms. The technician apologized and offered a modified treatment using lower heat and reduced pressure. Bryn refused any modifications, insisting she had paid for the full service. She continued recording while criticizing the technician's professionalism and refusing to acknowledge written safety warnings. After several minutes of escalating confrontation, the technician agreed to proceed with the standard protocol. The treatment began around 3 in the afternoon. Heated stones, typically maintained between 120 and 130 degrees, were positioned along Bryn's spine. The technician applied sustained pressure while the stones remained in place, periodically repositioning them according to standard sequencing. Bryn lay face down, partially draped, and did not voice discomfort during the early portion of the session. Restricted airflow within the open pavilion allowed heat to build, elevating the ambient room temperature. Approximately 20 minutes into the session, the technician noticed irregular breathing and reduced chest movement. Bryn's skin appeared unusually flushed, and perspiration had increased beyond what was typical for the treatment. When spoken to, she did not respond or move. The technician immediately removed the stones and checked for responsiveness. Bryn remained unresponsive, with a weak, rapid pulse detected at her wrist. Villa staff called emergency services while guests tried to cool her by removing linens and fanning air. Paramedics arrived about 18 minutes later and transported her to a nearby private hospital. But despite continued resuscitation, she went into cardiac arrest roughly 40 minutes after arrival and could not be revived. The medical examiner ruled the death an acute myocardial infarction complicated by heat stress and underlying coronary disease. Toxicology showed only prescribed medications. Investigators found she falsified the intake form and ignored repeated safety warnings. The spa faced no penalties and later discontinued heated stone services after authorities reviewed the case. It was May 9th, 2015, inside a small neighborhood hair salon in Phoenix, Arizona, where weekend clients filled the chairs and hood dryers hummed beneath warm afternoon light. Lana Wexler was 38 and worked part-time in an administrative office, known among co-workers for her impatience with delays and disregard for routine instructions when she felt rushed or inconvenienced. That afternoon, she had called ahead, requesting a last-minute appointment before an evening social gathering, anxious to finish quickly and leave on time. After her styling session, the stylist guided her beneath an older industrial hood dryer and instructed her to remain seated while the cooling cycle completed. Lana checked her phone repeatedly, growing restless as minutes passed and the machine continued running behind her. The salon remained busy around her. Another client sat quietly beneath a similar dryer, following standard protocol without issue. Staff moved between stations, trimming, rinsing, and styling as usual. The equipment around the room operated normally, filling the space with steady mechanical noise and circulating warm air. The hood dryer above Lana's chair was an older model, awaiting replacement parts. Investigators would later note that the rear ventilation guard had been removed weeks earlier after damage was discovered, leaving the intake opening partially exposed. Warning labels remained visible on the housing, cautioning users to remain stationary while the unit operated. Against the stylist's instructions, Lana rose abruptly from the chair while the dryer continued running at full speed. Her long hair, only loosely secured, fell free around her shoulders as she stood. As she straightened, several strands brushed against the exposed intake opening and were immediately pulled inward by the rotating fan assembly. The motor continued operating normally, drawing more hair into the internal mechanism. Lana instinctively turned toward the sudden pulling sensation, but the movement only fed additional strands into the compromised intake. Within seconds, tension built rapidly as her hair wrapped tightly around the spinning blades. Feeling the escalating force on her scalp, she attempted to step backward. Instead, the trapped strands drew her head violently upward toward the intake opening as the rotating mechanism continued winding her hair inward. Her face and neck were pulled against the rigid housing of the dryer as the machine maintained constant speed. Her neck hyperextended sharply under the mechanical traction, forcing her head into an unnatural position while the motor continued pulling. Within moments, the sustained force dislocated her upper cervical spine and caused catastrophic injury to the brainstem and spinal cord. When staff finally cut power to the unit, her body collapsed to the floor beneath the dryer, completely unresponsive, while her hair remained tightly trapped inside the intake mechanism. Emergency services were called immediately. Responders arrived within minutes and found Lana unresponsive with obvious signs of severe head and neck trauma. No resuscitation attempts were successful. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later determined the cause of death as a high cervical spine dislocation with fatal brainstem and spinal cord injury caused by mechanical traction from the entangled hair. The injury was consistent with sudden hyperextension under sustained pulling force. Investigators found the dryer had been operating normally, but the missing rear ventilation guard left the intake opening unprotected. The final report concluded that the death resulted from deferred maintenance and improper use, noting that either repairing the guard or remaining seated would have prevented the fatal entanglement entirely. It was March 2016, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the commercial alley behind a strip mall in Phoenix, Arizona. The desert heat had begun to ease, but the asphalt still radiated warmth from the day's scorching temperatures. Dumpsters lined the narrow passage between buildings, their steel surfaces baking in the remaining sunlight. Maren Gall, a 46-year-old retail supervisor, had developed a reputation among local shop employees for her aggressive scavenging habits. Her territorial nature and confrontational attitude made her unwelcome at most businesses, but she persisted in her belief that anything discarded became public property the moment it hit the dumpster. On this particular day, she had spotted what appeared to be valuable items protruding from a large commercial container. Several shop employees had gathered near the back entrance of their store, taking their afternoon break when Maren arrived. They watched as she dragged a folding step stool from her car, positioning it against the side of the dumpster. Posted warning decals clearly indicated that garbage pickup was scheduled for that evening, but Maren dismissed their concerns with her usual hostility. She accused the workers of harassment when they mentioned the imminent arrival of the waste collection truck. The dumpster's heavy steel lid was propped open on a warped hinge, creating a gap just wide enough for someone to climb through. Maren positioned her step stool and began climbing into the container, her movements deliberate despite the awkward angle. The employees retreated inside, unwilling to engage further with her increasingly aggressive behavior. As Maren shifted her weight against the rim, the dumpster's warped hinge finally gave way. The heavy steel lid dropped under its own weight, swinging downward with brutal momentum. The descending lid struck the back of Maren's head and upper neck, causing a catastrophic occipital skull fracture and cervical spine injury that rendered her unconscious instantly among the broken glass, soaked cardboard, and loose debris that filled the container. Her body lay motionless in the darkness as the sound of approaching hydraulics grew louder. The counterbalanced hinge system that should have prevented such catastrophic failure had failed due to metal fatigue and prior structural damage from repeated use and improper maintenance. The garbage truck rounded the corner into the alley sometime shortly after, its driver following his regular route. The hydraulic arms automatically clamped onto the dumpster's sides and lifted the entire container high overhead. As the mechanism tilted the dumpster forward, Marin's unconscious body slid helplessly into the truck's hopper along with the rest of the waste. The compactor ram activated with its programmed sequence, applying thousands of pounds of hydraulic pressure to compress the mixed debris. Her ribs fractured under the immense force. Her pelvis collapsed, and internal organs ruptured as the machinery continued its relentless cycle. The driver, unaware of the tragedy unfolding behind him, completed his route and headed toward the transfer station. Hours later, workers at the waste processing facility made the grim discovery during the routine unloading process. Human remains were found among the compressed garbage, prompting an immediate investigation. The medical examiner determined that Marin had suffered severe head trauma from the falling lid before the fatal crushing injuries occurred during compaction. Investigators interviewed the shop employees who had witnessed the initial confrontation and confirmed the sequence of events. Security footage from a nearby loading dock camera captured the lid dropping as Marin leaned into the container, providing crucial evidence for the investigation. The death was officially ruled accidental, resulting from unauthorized entry into a commercial waste container. The case highlighted the dangers of dumpster diving and the unpredictable nature of industrial waste collection equipment in urban environments.
It was July 18th, 2014, and the back patio of a house on a residential street in Roswell, Georgia, was being used for routine food preparation for a small catering job. The evening was warm and quiet, and the setting was otherwise ordinary for residential use. Patrice Dunham, 52, had lived in the neighborhood for over a decade and served on an architectural review committee where she frequently submitted objections regarding landscaping, fencing, and outdoor decor. She worked part-time as a bookkeeper and had no elected authority within the community. I don't think it takes official power for people to start acting like they have it. Over the previous year, she had filed multiple complaints against a neighboring family regarding noise, parking, and alleged violations related to home-based business activity, all of which had been dismissed. She had also been formally asked to stop directly confronting residents after repeated disputes. She had a known severe allergy to tree nuts and carried emergency medication for it, which she was aware was critical in exposure situations. The Nguyen family operated a permitted home catering business specializing in Vietnamese cuisine. That evening, they were preparing a dessert that included crushed walnuts as an ingredient. The food preparation area was set up in the backyard, with ingredients organized on a table. Family members were present in different parts of the home, with the catering work ongoing and undisturbed prior to the incident. Patrice entered the property through an unlocked side gate without prior notice or invitation. She began recording and verbally stating that she was documenting what she believed to be a violation of community rules. She approached the food preparation area despite being told to leave. Her behavior escalated from observation to direct interference as she engaged with the ingredients on the table. She picked up a bowl containing crushed walnuts and handled it while continuing to record. When instructed again to stop and leave the property, she remained focused on documenting the scene. She then touched the contents directly with her fingers and brought them close to her face, continuing to speak as she handled the bowl. In the process, she transferred residue from her fingers to her mouth and lips. For individuals with severe sensitivity, even small amounts introduced this way can trigger a rapid and life-threatening reaction. Shortly after the contact, she began showing signs of distress. Her speech became interrupted, and she indicated that something was wrong. Visible swelling developed around her lips and face within moments. She retrieved emergency medication from her bag, but struggled to use it effectively. During the escalation of symptoms, others present attempted to assist. Even when help is right there, execution under panic is a completely different situation. The medication was ultimately administered after a short delay, but the reaction continued to progress. Emergency services were contacted and arrived within minutes. She was conscious but in severe respiratory distress with restricted airflow and rapidly declining oxygen levels. She was treated on site, transported for advanced care, and remained in intensive care but did not regain neurological function. Life support was later withdrawn. The cause of death was anaphylactic shock from exposure to tree nut allergens, involving rapid airway constriction, vascular collapse, and reduced oxygen delivery to vital organs. Medical evaluation noted that the delayed use of emergency medication contributed to the outcome, though symptoms had already reached a critical stage before effective intervention. Authorities reviewed the incident and found no grounds for charges. The catering operation was confirmed to be compliant with local regulations, and prior complaints against the property had been previously dismissed, leading to case closure.
It was May 29th, 2013. The afternoon heat in Scottsdale, Arizona, shimmered off Spanish tile rooftops as Donna Kruger stood in her backyard, squinting at the cloudless sky. At 45, she had spent the last 3 months waging what neighbors described as an increasingly erratic campaign against delivery drones, convinced they were violating her property rights and spying on her daily routines. Donna had inherited her grandfather's 12-gauge shotgun after his death the previous winter, but possessed no formal firearms training beyond loading shells. A former insurance adjuster who had been laid off 2 years earlier, she spent her days monitoring online forums about property rights and airspace laws, becoming convinced that commercial drones represented a personal invasion. Her social media posts showed an escalating obsession with defending her territory, often photographing aircraft overhead and researching legal precedents about airspace ownership. Modern delivery drones operate at altitudes between 200 to 400 feet, well within federal airspace regulations, and in 2013 were primarily limited to small test programs and survey flights rather than widespread consumer delivery. Donna had filed multiple complaints with local authorities about drone activity over her neighborhood, claiming the aircraft were conducting surveillance and violating her privacy rights. That Tuesday morning, Donna had received another dismissive response from the authorities regarding her complaints about unauthorized drone flights. Neighbors reported hearing her shouting about taking matters into her own hands while pacing in her backyard. Around 2 in the afternoon, a test survey drone, operating as part of a limited pilot program, approached her neighborhood, following its programmed route to a nearby address. Donna grabbed her grandfather's shotgun and climbed onto her single-story home's Spanish tile roof. Despite having no experience with either firearms or roof navigation, the tiles, heated to over 140 degrees by the desert sun, made footing treacherous as she positioned herself near the roof's edge. Witnesses from neighboring properties watched as Donna raised the heavy shotgun toward the approaching drone, which was flying approximately 250 feet overhead. She had loaded the weapon with standard birdshot, completely inadequate for the distance and target. When she fired, the unexpected recoil caused her to lose footing on the superheated tiles. She tumbled backward, sliding down the steeply pitched roof, before falling approximately 20 feet into her landscaped garden below. Her body struck a decorative boulder arrangement, causing massive blunt force trauma to her head and torso. The shotgun fell separately and discharged upon impact due to inertia, causing the firing pin to strike, sending the second round harmlessly into the air. The combination of steep slope, heat, and heavy recoil made the slide unavoidable. A neighbor immediately called 911 after witnessing the fall. Paramedics arrived under 10 minutes, finding Donna conscious but bleeding heavily from multiple head wounds. Despite their efforts to stabilize her condition, she succumbed to severe brain trauma and internal bleeding during transport to the hospital. The The medical examiner determined that Donna died from massive blunt force trauma to the head and chest, with contributing factors including heat stress, dehydration, and blood loss. She had remained conscious for approximately 6 minutes after the fall, before losing consciousness permanently. Her estate was settled quietly, with the property sold after extensive cleanup and removal of the blood-stained landscaping where she had fallen.
It was October 8, 2017, in Sedona, Arizona. Desert heat beat down on the Red Rock landscape. A popular canyon trail was experiencing high foot traffic due to the holiday weekend. Lauren Whitmore, 44, was a corporate trainer from Chicago visiting Sedona with her husband for their anniversary. She had hiked portions of trails in Colorado on previous vacations and made a point of correcting other hikers she encountered about proper trail etiquette and gear choices. That morning, she had told other hikers at the trailhead that this route was overrated and too crowded for what it offered. She had little patience for casual hikers who treated trails like amusement parks rather than serious outdoor activities. Lauren had been complaining about the crowd since they started, making comments about people moving too slowly and blocking the trail for photos. She had tried to push past several groups on narrow sections and made remarks about tourists ruining everything. Her husband tried to calm her down multiple times, but she dismissed him. At a crowded section where the trail narrowed near a scenic viewpoint, Lauren stopped in frustration. Her husband suggested they wait a few minutes for the group ahead to clear. Lauren refused, stating she had not driven all this way to stand in line. She pointed to what appeared to be a parallel path approximately 20 feet to the right, a dried creek bed with flat sand that seemed to bypass the congestion. Her husband said it looked unsafe and they should stay on the marked trail. Lauren dismissed him, saying the trail designers had not accounted for this many people. Lauren stepped off the main trail onto the unmarked route without waiting. The dried creek bed appeared solid, with a light-colored sandy surface that looked firm. She walked approximately 60 feet along it, moving faster than the main trail crowd. Her husband called out repeatedly, but she waved him off without turning around. Her right foot suddenly sank several inches into the sand. She stopped and tried to pull it out, but her left foot also began sinking. The surface sand was dry and appeared solid, but beneath it was saturated sand and silt from recent rainfall. Lauren's weight had broken through the thin crust. She tried to lift her right leg, but the suction pulled her deeper. She leaned forward to brace with her hands, but this shifted more weight onto her lower body. Within 90 seconds, she was trapped to her knees and leaning forward at an awkward angle as the saturated sand tightened around her legs. Her husband reached the creek bed edge and attempted to pull her out by her arms, but each attempt caused the surrounding sand to collapse tighter around her legs. Other hikers called emergency services and searched for branches for leverage. Lauren was breathing heavily in the extreme heat, visibly exhausted. She was trapped to her upper thighs, bent forward in a position that compressed her diaphragm. Approximately 6 minutes after getting stuck, Lauren stopped responding. Her head drooped forward, and she lost consciousness, collapsing further into the sand. Hikers attempted to lift her upper body, but the suction made it nearly impossible. Specialized rescue personnel reached the creek bed nearly 40 minutes after the first emergency call. By then, the surrounding sand had hardened around Lauren's legs, requiring controlled digging and water to loosen the packed silt before she could be freed. When rescuers finally pulled her from the ground, she showed no signs of consciousness. Investigators later concluded that prolonged entrapment in extreme heat, combined with the forward compressed position of her body, led to a rapid medical collapse before rescue teams could stabilize her. Her death was attributed to heat-related stress and positional asphyxia after leaving the marked trail and entering unstable terrain.
It was May 3rd, 2019, when early evening light filtered through the windows of a small restaurant in a coastal village south of Naples. The dining room held 8 tables with checkered cloth, and the smell of garlic and tomato drifted from a narrow kitchen. Devin Pritchard was 47 years old and worked as a civil litigation attorney in Denver. She had traveled to Italy with her sister for a 10-day tour and was described as confrontational, often relying on legal threats when challenged. The family-owned restaurant specialized in fresh seafood. Devin had a documented severe shellfish allergy and carried a prescribed epinephrine auto-injector. After being seated, Devin questioned the server about cross-contamination risks. The server explained the kitchen was small, with shared equipment, and could not guarantee safety. Devin ordered a shrimp pasta without shrimp and refused alternative dishes. When told safety could not be assured, she demanded the owner and threatened complaints under European disability regulations. After further consultation, the server returned and said the dish would be prepared only if Devon signed a written acknowledgement confirming she had been warned and was ordering against recommendation. Devon signed without reading carefully. The dish arrived about 20 minutes later. Devon ate roughly half. She soon mentioned that her throat felt strange, but dismissed concern, attributing it to wine. Within minutes, her voice became strained, and she repeatedly touched her neck. Redness spread across her face and neck. She stood and said she needed air. When asked about her epinephrine injector, she said it was in her purse. By the time her sister retrieved it outside, Devon was leaning against the exterior wall, breathing rapidly with audible wheezing and visible facial swelling. Her sister administered the auto-injector. Devon's condition worsened. She collapsed onto the cobblestone street as the restaurant owner called emergency services. Bystanders kept her on her side while monitoring breathing. Emergency responders arrived approximately 14 minutes later. They found Devon unresponsive with severe airway swelling and initiated advanced airway management before transporting her under resuscitation to a hospital roughly 30 minutes away. Despite aggressive treatment, including epinephrine, antihistamines, and mechanical ventilation, Devon suffered cardiac arrest from prolonged oxygen deprivation. Resuscitation continued for over 40 minutes without success. She was pronounced dead approximately 2 hours after ingestion. Post-mortem examination determined that death resulted from anaphylactic shock due to shellfish protein exposure, with respiratory failure leading to cardiac arrest. Laboratory analysis confirmed trace shrimp protein consistent with cross-contamination. Italian authorities determined the restaurant followed appropriate protocols by providing warnings and obtaining written acknowledgement. No charges were filed. It was February 2nd, 2018, when an overcast afternoon settled over a loading dock behind a mid-sized shopping plaza in central Ohio, where slick asphalt and steady drizzle slowed delivery operations. Sophia Dre, a 47-year-old resident coordinator at the neighboring apartment complex, had spent the last 8 years managing various tenant relations and facility access issues across properties in the region. Known among building staff for her domineering attitude and tendency to bypass established procedures when she deemed them inconvenient, Sophia approached situations with the confidence of someone who believed her status as a long-term resident trumped posted regulations. She had received multiple written notices from property management regarding unauthorized access to restricted areas, but had never faced serious consequences. That afternoon, she was attempting to retrieve a designer handbag she had accidentally discarded into the commercial waste compactor before the scheduled evening pickup. The standard retrieval protocol involved contacting maintenance staff who held keys to the compactor's access panel and lockout controls. However, the large industrial compactor sat with its top-loading door propped open, the machine's motor humming in standby mode. The unit had been left accessible during an interrupted maintenance check, with the operator having stepped away temporarily. The control key remained in the panel, as was common practice during active service intervals. Rather than waiting for maintenance to return, Sophia made a calculated decision to retrieve the item herself. She approached the compactor and, ignoring the prominent warning decals about unauthorized access, positioned a nearby plastic milk crate against the unit's side. Using this as a step, she hoisted herself up and over the 4-foot metal rim, lowering herself into the compactor's chamber. The interior space measured approximately 6 feet deep, with vertical steel walls and a flat compression plate currently retracted at the top position. A maintenance worker returning with supplies called out a warning, but Sophia dismissed the concern with an irritated response. As Sophia bent down, searching through the compressed refuse pile, her weight shifted against the interior wall. This triggered the pressure-sensitive safety mechanism, but the system had been temporarily bypassed during the maintenance procedure. The compactor's automated cycle, still armed from its previous operational setting, interpreted the pressure change as a signal to resume the compression sequence. The massive steel plate, weighing over 800 pounds, began its motorized descent from the top of the chamber. The electric motor's steady hum blended with the ambient noise of delivery trucks and ventilation systems throughout the service corridor. Sophia realized the danger as the plate descended, but the smooth vertical walls offered no handholds for escape. The opening remained 4 feet above, now impossible to reach. The compression plate continued its programmed cycle, designed to compact waste into dense blocks. The sustained pressure compressed her body against the accumulated refuse and the chamber floor. The mechanical force continued through its full programmed compression cycle as the automated system completed its sequence. A delivery driver discovered the situation when noticing Sophia's shoes visible at the base of the compactor chamber. Emergency responders arrived within 11 minutes, but Sophia was found unresponsive. The compactor was immediately shut down and the plate reversed, but revival attempts were unsuccessful. The county coroner's examination determined the cause of death as crush asphyxia, resulting from sustained compression of the thoracic cavity. The official incident report documented Sophia's unauthorized entry into the restricted equipment, noting that standard safety protocols required contacting maintenance staff rather than personal retrieval attempts. The compactor showed no mechanical malfunction, operating exactly as designed. Property safety investigators concluded that proper adherence to posted procedures would have prevented the incident entirely. It was April 15th, 2015, at a community recreation center in Boulder, Colorado. Late afternoon light filtered through tall windows, stretching across polished hardwood floors lined with evenly spaced yoga mats. Ceiling fans hummed softly above the quiet murmur of participants settling into place for a beginner inversion workshop. Along one wall, reinforced padding had been installed specifically for supported headstand practice. 48-year-old Dexton Swale arrived early and positioned her mat directly in the center of the room, rather than near the padded wall area reserved for beginners. She owned a small retail business and was known among acquaintances for turning routine situations into confrontations. In previous classes, she had openly challenged instructors, correcting cues and dismissing safety reminders as overcautious. She often framed structured guidance as incompetence and had begun attending the workshop with the stated goal of proving that foundation drills were unnecessary for someone with her level of fitness. Over the prior weeks, she had ignored repeated recommendations to build shoulder strength and practice supported inversions first. During warm-ups that afternoon, she interrupted alignment corrections and questioned why experienced adults were being instructed in what she considered an overly simplified manner. Several participants shifted uncomfortably as the instructor calmly reiterated that unsupported headstands carried significant risk without proper conditioning and wall support. The instructor emphasized that falls from vertical alignment could drive axial force directly into the cervical spine. When the time came to practice, most students moved to the padded wall section. Dexton remained in the center of the hardwood floor rather than moving to the padded wall area. She declined foam blocks and brushed away the instructor's offer to spot her entry. Witnesses later stated that her tone had grown sharper as she insisted she did not need assistance. She planted her forearms and interlocked her fingers, placing the crown of her head on the floor. With a controlled kick upward, she lifted both legs into a freestanding headstand. For several seconds, she maintained vertical balance. Then her right elbow shifted slightly outward on the smooth surface, narrowing her base of support. Her hips drifted forward past center. Without wall contact to stop rotation, her body tipped beyond vertical. Witnesses reported that she attempted to correct by arching backward, but the adjustment accelerated the fall. Her full body weight drove downward as the top of her head struck the hardwood floor. Several participants later reported hearing a heavy impact followed by sudden silence. She collapsed immediately. Students described her eyes open and fixed for several seconds. but she did not move her arms or legs. Her breathing became shallow and irregular. The instructor stabilized her head and instructed others to call emergency services while preventing anyone from attempting to lift her. Responders arrived within 12 minutes and applied full spinal immobilization before transport. En route, she required assisted ventilation due to compromised respiratory effort. Hospital imaging later confirmed a severe fracture at the C1 to C2 level with spinal cord involvement near the brainstem. Despite surgical intervention and mechanical ventilation in intensive care, swelling at the injury site and confirmed spinal cord disruption resulted in loss of independent breathing. After 2 days on life support, Dexton Swale was pronounced deceased. Investigators documented that repeated safety warnings about unsupported inversions had been provided during the session. The medical examiner ruled the death an accidental recreational injury caused by complications of a high cervical spine fracture sustained during the fall.
The next situation I found shifts into a grocery store where the setting feels ordinary right up until it doesn't. It was November 3rd, 2020, and a grocery store in Naperville, Illinois, was operating through a routine morning rush. Checkout lines, fluorescent lighting, and the steady noise of refrigeration units. Nothing about the scene suggested anything out of the ordinary. Rhonda Peltier, 61, was a retired direct sales representative active in online medical skepticism and personal rights groups. She had no significant medical history. She was physically healthy, wore reading glasses on a lanyard around her neck, and carried a large, structured tote bag she used as a purse. The kind with a rigid flat bottom and exterior zip pockets she frequently rifled through during arguments to produce her phone. At the store entrance, a sign required face coverings. Rhonda entered without one, stating she was exempt after a brief exchange with staff. She then proceeded inside and later joined a checkout line behind Carol Sims, a cancer patient wearing a mask and moving slowly with her groceries. Rhonda commented on Carol's mask, despite no interaction being initiated by Carol. When Carol did not respond, Rhonda reached forward and pulled the mask from Carol's face by the ear loop. Carol took it back and quietly stated she was undergoing chemotherapy and asked to be left alone. Rhonda dismissed the statement and continued speaking loudly about masks, rights, and restrictions. Several customers in nearby lines began recording the interaction. It didn't even feel like anything serious at first, just people slowly starting to watch. A store employee approached and asked Rhonda to step back from the customer. She refused and continued raising her voice. The situation drew attention from staff, and a manager attempted to de-escalate the conflict. Rhonda remained focused on arguing her position, speaking over instructions and gesturing repeatedly. Her behavior became increasingly agitated and physically animated, drawing further attention from surrounding customers. As the confrontation continued, Rhonda reached into her tote bag and pulled out her phone to record what she called harassment by store staff. In doing so, she also dislodged a travel-size hand lotion bottle, cylindrical, uncapped at the bottom, which fell from the bag and landed on the tile floor behind her right foot without her noticing. A moment later, Rhonda took one step backward, a standard shift in posture during the argument, and her right heel landed directly on the lotion bottle. The bottle rolled outward. Her foot went with it. She had no time to correct. Her body weight was already shifting backward, and her arms were occupied, phone in one hand, tote strap in the other. She went down fast, straight back, with nothing to catch herself on. The back of her head struck the tile floor with a single, flat impact. Several witnesses described the sound. She did not attempt to get up. She was unconscious immediately after impact and did not respond to her name. A customer kneeling beside her noted that her right pupil appeared larger than her left within approximately 2 minutes of the fall. Staff called emergency services and began assisting her. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation was started while waiting for medical response. Bystanders continued recording the scene as staff attempted basic life support measures. She was treated on scene due to unresponsiveness and transported to a hospital. A CT scan confirmed a large acute epidural hematoma, a blood clot pressing on the brain from the point of impact at the base of the skull. Emergency neurosurgery was performed, but the herniation had already caused irreversible brainstem damage. She did not regain consciousness. Life support was withdrawn 4 days later. The cause of death was acute epidural hematoma secondary to blunt force head trauma. Manner of death accidental. The back of her skull struck the tile floor with sufficient force to fracture the occipital bone and lacerate a blood vessel beneath it, causing rapid bleeding between the skull and brain that compressed critical structures within minutes. Her phone, still recording, was recovered face up on the floor, with footage ending at the moment she stepped back.
It was April 3rd, 2016. The morning air in Queens, New York carried the usual urban mix of exhaust and cooking smells, masking the danger that would claim 3 lives before noon. Trisha Volkoff, 51, owned 4 duplex units across Queens, inherited from her father's modest real estate portfolio. Over 15 years, she built a reputation among tenants and housing advocates for aggressive tactics, illegal lockouts, utility shutoffs, and intimidation aimed at silencing maintenance complaints. Property management collectives knew her for openly dismissing repair requests as freeloading. Her strategy was straightforward: make conditions intolerable so tenants left on their own, avoiding formal eviction proceedings. Trisha's properties featured aging gas lines, outdated electrical systems, and heating units that should have been replaced decades earlier. Other tenants said that she viewed maintenance requests as personal attacks on her business model. That morning, Trisha was targeting Kimberly Santos, a single mother living in Unit 2B with her 6-year-old son. Kimberly had filed multiple complaints about heating issues and requested repairs that would cost several $1,000s. Rather than address the problems, Trisha decided to shut off gas service to force them out. At 10:30 a.m., surveillance footage from a nearby bodega showed Trisha entering the basement utility area through the side service door, carrying bolt cutters and a small toolbox. The basement was poorly ventilated with stagnant air and no active exhaust, allowing gas to linger. Her online history showed she had researched the building's gas system and believed she could disconnect service to Unit 2B without affecting others. Instead of an apartment-specific line, she tampered with an exposed branch off the main gas riser feeding the rear units, mistaking it for a shutoff. She spent several minutes loosening a corroded union fitting, noticed the gas odor intensifying, then left quickly, assuming it was a minor release that would dissipate without warning anyone or checking for leaks. Gas quickly spread into enclosed spaces above the basement, moving through wall cavities, stairwell chases, and into Unit 2B. Kimberly had left for lunch less than an hour earlier. Ignition sources in her apartment were limited to normal household appliances, including a refrigerator and a gas boiler with automatic relays. Poor ventilation and closed winter windows trapped the gas, allowing it to build to dangerous levels. Several tenants later reported a strong hallway odor, but assumed it was a brief maintenance issue and did not call 911. Around 11:25 a.m., Kimberly returned from lunch and moved quickly through the apartment without stopping to investigate the smell, later determined to have been masked by street food and boulevard exhaust. As she reached the kitchen, one of several possible ignition sources, later believed to include the refrigerator's thermostat cycling, produced a small electrical spark. The ignition occurred in the kitchen, triggering an explosion that sent a rapid pressure wave through adjacent gas-filled rooms, blew out interior walls, compromised load-bearing supports, and led to partial second-floor collapse, hurling debris into nearby storefronts. Trisha had returned minutes earlier to check her progress and was standing near the building's entrance when the blast occurred. The explosion threw her multiple feet into the street, where falling concrete crushed her chest and skull. Kimberly and her son, who had been in the kitchen, sustained unsurvivable injuries. Emergency responders arrived within 8 minutes, but all 3 victims had injuries incompatible with survival. The medical examiner determined Trisha died from catastrophic blunt force trauma, internal organ rupture, and severe thermal injuries consistent with a gas explosion. The report concluded death occurred within seconds of the blast for all 3 victims. The investigation revealed years of unauthorized utility modifications across her properties, including tampered valves, mismatched fittings, and evidence of prior unpermitted shutoffs. The remaining tenants formed a housing cooperative and successfully sued Trish's estate for damages.
It was July 16, 2016, in Napa Valley, California. The sun dipped toward the horizon, casting golden light across the vineyards. An outdoor wedding reception was being held at a vineyard estate with approximately 140 guests in attendance. Valerie Hutchins, 38, was a real estate agent from San Francisco who specialized in luxury properties. She was known for walking out of listings that didn't meet her standards and had been asked to leave several open houses after making loud criticisms about staging choices. Friends who knew her well had learned to avoid inviting her to casual gatherings, as she had a habit of pointing out what she considered tacky decor or subpar catering. She had flown in specifically for this wedding and had complained about the parking situation and the lack of valet service. She also made pointed observations about what she considered poor planning, from the mismatched chair covers to the amateur floral arrangements. She had been drinking wine steadily since the cocktail hour began at 6 p.m., growing louder with each glass. Valerie wore a cocktail dress and heeled sandals. Her hands were damp from condensation on her wine glass and the humid evening air. She had no technical knowledge of generators or electrical systems. Approximately 10 minutes after confronting the staff member, Valerie walked away from her table toward the generator location. Several guests noticed her heading in that direction but did not follow. She moved behind the lattice panels where the generator sat on a rubber mat. The generator was running at full capacity, with multiple heavy-duty extension cords connected to its outlets. The unit's metal frame was grounded, but investigators later noted damage to the protective casing near the connection panel had exposed a live electrical point. Valerie gripped the generator's metal frame with both hands, attempting to drag or push it away from the seating area. The unit weighed approximately 200 pounds and did not move. She adjusted her grip, placing her right hand on the frame and her left hand near the electrical panel where the cords were connected. Her left hand made contact with an exposed terminal where the protective casing had cracked. The generator was actively supplying electrical power through its outlets. Investigators later determined she made contact with an exposed live connection, allowing current to pass through her body while her other hand remained on the metal frame. The electrical current caused immediate involuntary muscle contractions. Valerie's hands clenched tighter around the contact points, preventing her from releasing her grip. Her body went rigid, and she remained in contact with the generator for several seconds before collapsing backward onto the ground. A guest walking toward the restroom area saw Valerie fall and called out for help. Valerie was lying on her back, unresponsive and not breathing. Her hands showed visible burn marks. Guests immediately called emergency services while others began CPR, and the generator was shut off within about 90 seconds. Responders arrived 9 minutes later and continued resuscitation efforts, but Valerie never regained consciousness or a pulse. She was transported to a medical facility and pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The cause of death was cardiac arrest from electrical shock, with burn marks on both hands confirming sustained contact with a live electrical source. Investigators later determined a recently damaged casing had exposed energized components while the generator was running. The death was ruled accidental, and civil liability claims against the venue were eventually settled privately.
It was October 14th, 2018, when a quiet evening in a modest home in southern Indiana ended in a fatal kitchen accident. Outside, autumn temperatures had begun to drop, but inside the single-story house, dinner preparations were underway beneath warm overhead lighting. The kitchen contained aging appliances that had been in regular use for years, including an older model stovetop pressure cooker stored beneath the counter. Marla Kinsey was 44 and worked in local delivery services, spending long days driving neighborhood routes and meeting strict deadlines. According to co-workers and family members, she was known for an assertive personality and a strong belief that experience outweighed written instructions. Investigators later noted that she had a documented history of dismissing manufacturer safety guidelines and treating warning labels as unnecessary precautions. That evening, she prepared to use the pressure cooker to finish a meal. Her husband had earlier noticed hardened food residue accumulating around the appliance's pressure release valve and suggested that it be cleaned before the next use. Records later showed that the instruction manual, which outlined regular valve maintenance and lid locking procedures, had never been opened since the appliance was purchased 2 years earlier. According to investigators, Marla refused assistance and attempted to secure the lid herself after it failed to seat normally against the rim. Instead of stopping to inspect the obstruction, she applied additional force until the locking mechanism engaged. Multiple warning labels on the cooker indicated that improper sealing and blocked venting systems could cause dangerous pressure buildup, but those warnings were ignored. She then activated the burner and increased the heat to maximum. Within minutes, internal temperature began climbing rapidly inside the sealed chamber. Later, examination showed that hardened residue had obstructed both the primary and secondary pressure release systems, preventing normal venting. With no functional escape path, pressure rose far beyond the cooker's design limits. The aluminum vessel expanded as internal force increased. Stress fractures formed around the lid locking assembly, which had already been weakened by improper seating. As the cooker continued heating, the locking ring began to deform under the mounting load. Investigators determined that Marla had leaned directly over the cooker, attempting to inspect the lid as pressure continued to rise. Moments later, the locking mechanism failed completely. The lid separated from the vessel and launched upward with explosive force, propelled by compressed steam and boiling contents. The metal lid struck her face and skull at close range, delivering massive blunt force trauma. She collapsed beside the stovetop as superheated steam vented violently into the kitchen. Family members immediately contacted emergency services. Paramedics arrived to find extensive head injuries incompatible with survival. Marla was pronounced dead at the scene. A subsequent investigation found no mechanical defect in the appliance itself. The coroner ruled the cause of death as catastrophic blunt force head trauma resulting from a pressure cooker lid becoming a high-velocity projectile. Inspectors documented multiple safety violations, including a clogged vent system, forced closure of the lid, and operation at excessive heat levels despite clear warning labels. The final report concluded that the accident was entirely preventable. Proper cleaning of the pressure release valve, adherence to manufacturer instructions, and use of standard operating procedures would have prevented pressure from reaching lethal levels. The incident was classified as a fatal user error explosion caused by willful disregard of basic appliance safety protocols. It was January 2018, and a bitter winter morning had settled over Newark, New Jersey, with temperatures hovering near freezing and light snow dusting the sidewalks. Inside a mid-rise apartment building, maintenance crews had arrived early to conduct routine elevator inspections required by city safety codes. The building's aging traction elevator system had been experiencing intermittent mechanical issues, prompting management to schedule comprehensive maintenance. Petra Hinge, a 62-year-old leasing assistant known for her controlling personality and abusive treatment of maintenance staff, had developed a reputation for interfering with building operations. Her territorial nature and sense of authority over common areas had created ongoing conflicts with both residents and service personnel. Despite repeated warnings from building management, Petra consistently ignored posted notices. The maintenance team had positioned orange warning cones around the elevator entrance and posted clear signage indicating that the system was temporarily out of service. The traction elevator had been placed in inspection mode, which disabled normal operation and allowed technicians to manually control its position, using a hold-to-run switch for safety checks. During this process, the car often remained misaligned with floor levels, while technicians adjusted its position incrementally. Petra arrived at the elevator bank and immediately began arguing with the maintenance workers, accusing them of deliberately inconveniencing residents. She shoved the warning cones aside and demanded immediate access to the elevator, claiming that her work responsibilities took priority over routine maintenance. The technicians explained that the car was currently positioned several inches below the floor level and that they were actively adjusting it, despite multiple warnings from the maintenance crew about the dangerous misalignment. Petra forced open the elevator doors using the emergency release mechanism. The gap between the floor and the elevator car was clearly visible. The elevator car was positioned more than a foot below the landing level, creating a dangerous vertical gap. The technicians shouted additional warnings as she approached the opening. Without hesitation, Petra stepped forward with one leg inside the elevator car and her upper body still outside the doorway. Her foot found empty space where the elevator floor should have been, and she fell forward into the gap. At that precise moment, a technician on a different floor was operating the inspection control panel, pressing the Hold to Run button to jog the elevator car upward to the next alignment position as part of the standard inspection procedure. Petra became trapped at the waist between the rising elevator car and the building's floor edge. The traction system's motor responded to the technician's control input, applying tremendous upward force against her midsection. Her pelvic bones fractured immediately under the crushing pressure as the car moved upward several inches before the technician released the control button. The immense pressure compressed her internal organs, causing severe internal bleeding and damage to vital structures. Petra lost consciousness within seconds as her body went into traumatic shock. The maintenance crew immediately activated emergency stop procedures and attempted to reverse the car's position, but the damage had already occurred during the brief mechanical movement. Emergency medical personnel arrived within minutes, but the severity of Petra's injuries made successful treatment impossible. The crushing trauma to her pelvis and abdomen had caused irreversible damage to multiple organ systems. She was pronounced dead at the scene, despite resuscitation attempts. Building inspectors conducted a thorough investigation, examining the elevator's mechanical systems and maintenance logs. The inspection revealed that all safety protocols had been properly followed by the maintenance crew, that appropriate warnings had been posted, and that the technician had been performing standard inspection procedures when the unauthorized entry occurred. The medical examiner ruled the death accidental, caused by crushing injuries sustained during unauthorized entry into an elevator shaft during active maintenance operations.
Now this next story opens up completely onto a highway, where distance between vehicles becomes the main factor shaping everything that follows. It was March 22nd, 2017, and a stretch of interstate highway was experiencing steady morning traffic under a flat, gray sky. The road surface was dry and visibility was clear. Conditions were normal, with no environmental factors contributing to risk beyond routine highway flow. Tammy Grulich, 47, worked in medical billing and commuted twice weekly to a medical office in Zanesville. She had no criminal or significant medical history. She consistently wore a seatbelt and had no known mechanical issues with her vehicle. In the year prior, she had expressed frequent frustration with other drivers and often characterized herself as more competent than those around her, particularly in congested or high-speed traffic conditions. Derek Osee, 34, drove a box truck transporting medical supplies along regional routes. He had 6 years of professional driving experience without at-fault incidents. Approximately 3 miles behind him, Greg and Susan Farwell were traveling with their 2 grandchildren in a minivan after a family visit. They maintained standard highway spacing and steady speed consistent with normal traffic flow. As vehicles merged from an on-ramp, Derek entered the right lane at highway speed with proper signaling. Tammy, approaching from behind at a higher speed, rapidly closed the distance and began aggressive interaction, including flashing her headlights. She then moved into the left lane, drew alongside the truck, and blocked its ability to change lanes before cutting sharply in front of it. Derek reduced speed to maintain safe spacing and did not engage. If it were me, I would have backed off right there instead of trying to hold position that close to a truck. But over the next several miles, Tammy continued a pattern of escalating aggressive driving behavior. She repeatedly alternated between speeding up and slowing down, creating unstable flow for surrounding vehicles. At multiple points, she forced following drivers to brake unexpectedly, then accelerated again once gaps widened. Her driving pattern required constant adjustment from traffic behind her and reduced overall roadway predictability. The behavior escalated further when she performed a sudden and extreme deceleration from highway speed to a near stop within seconds. This created an immediate hazard for all vehicles behind her. Derek changed lanes to avoid contact. The minivan following behind her was already required to adjust speed repeatedly due to her prior actions, and now had insufficient distance to fully stop. The minivan struck the rear of her vehicle at high speed. The impact propelled her car forward into the lane ahead, where it continued until it passed beneath the rear structure of the box truck in front of it. The underride guard engaged the upper portion of the cabin. The structural intrusion caused collapse of the roof and upper frame of the vehicle. Tammy, restrained by her seatbelt, sustained severe trauma during both impacts. The initial rear collision caused serious spinal and thoracic injuries due to seatbelt loading forces. The subsequent underride impact caused catastrophic injury to the head and chest region, resulting in immediate loss of vital function. She would not have remained conscious after the second impact. The vehicle came to rest on the shoulder of the highway. The truck driver brought his vehicle to a controlled stop and immediately contacted emergency services. Responders arrived shortly afterward. Occupants of the minivan sustained non-life-threatening injuries and were treated at the scene. The children in the vehicle were unharmed. The cause of death was multiple blunt force traumatic injuries from a two-phase collision sequence. The first impact caused severe but potentially survivable injuries. The second impact, involving underride intrusion into the passenger compartment, caused fatal trauma to the head, chest, and major blood vessels, resulting in rapid circulatory failure. The initiating factor in the sequence was determined to be sudden and extreme deceleration, combined with repeated aggressive driving behavior that destabilized surrounding traffic. The incident was reviewed for contributing factors related to vehicle spacing, braking behavior, and collision dynamics. The findings contributed to ongoing discussions in commercial vehicle safety regarding risk created by abrupt deceleration in high-speed traffic environments.
It was November 22, 2017. The dusty roads of Córdoba province in Argentina stretched endlessly under the Argentine sun, their isolation hiding dangers that would claim a life before sunset. Marie Kowalski, 42, had relocated from Minneapolis 6 months earlier, seeking a fresh start after a series of road rage incidents had cost her employment at a regional insurance firm. Her Minnesota driving record showed multiple citations for aggressive driving and a restraining order from a driver she had pursued home on 2 separate occasions. Her relatives recalled she viewed confrontations behind the wheel as tests of principle, rarely considering the risk of escalation. Her move to Argentina had not changed her fundamental approach to driving conflicts. Local residents and neighbors noted several tense encounters she'd had in the preceding months, with minor horn-honking disputes and gestures that never escalated into physical violence but drew wary stares. Language barriers had prevented full escalation, leaving Marie frustrated and increasingly insistent that others understand her position. On the day of the incident, Marie believed a motorcyclist had cut her off at a rural intersection outside the city. The perceived slight triggered her familiar pattern of pursuit, following the rider for approximately 12 miles through increasingly remote countryside. Her dashboard camera captured her voice, growing more agitated as she narrated her grievances, convinced the motorcyclist needed to be confronted about his dangerous driving. The motorcyclist, unaware of Marie's intentions, said that he simply continued toward his home along the isolated dirt road. When he turned into his property's long driveway, Marie followed without hesitation. Her dash cam recorded her parking behind his motorcycle, effectively blocking his exit route. She immediately exited her vehicle and began walking toward him, shouting in broken Spanish about his driving, mispronouncing words, and mixing English phrases in a way investigators later said likely worsened confusion and made her intent harder to interpret. The homeowner retreated toward his garage, repeatedly gesturing for Marie to leave his property. Marie ignored his warnings, continuing to advance while pointing accusingly and raising her voice. Her fragmented Spanish and failure to respond to his shouted commands appeared to be interpreted as refusal rather than misunderstanding, increasing his visible agitation. The dashboard camera captured her stepping closer despite his obvious distress and defensive posture, though the camera's fixed forward angle limited clear visibility once she moved fully out of frame. As Marie moved to within a few feet, the motorcyclist drew a legally registered handgun possessed under a valid provincial firearms authorization, again ordering her to stop. Investigators later noted that he remained positioned near the garage entrance with limited retreat options. The camera recorded Marie shouting defiantly and taking another step forward just before a single gunshot echoed across the property. She collapsed immediately beside her vehicle. The homeowner placed an emergency call shortly after the shooting, but the nearest hospital was approximately 45 minutes away. Paramedics arrived roughly 53 minutes after the shooting, finding Marie had already succumbed to her injuries. The dashboard camera provided a continuous visual and audio record of the pursuit and confrontation, though not every movement was fully visible. The autopsy revealed a single gunshot wound to the chest, causing massive internal bleeding and lung collapse. Death occurred within minutes from blood loss and respiratory failure, with injuries determined to be rapidly fatal. Provincial authorities reviewed the dashboard footage, witness statements, and ballistic evidence and conducted a formal prosecutorial review before ruling the shooting justified self-defense under Argentine law weeks later. Marie's body was repatriated to Minnesota, where a small funeral service was held for family members.
It was November 3rd, 2015, in Denver, Colorado. Frost clung to the grass as the sun climbed higher. A residential neighborhood of single-family homes had been experiencing intermittent natural gas service issues due to aging infrastructure. Rita Drummond, 52, had lived in her two-story home for 14 years and worked part-time doing bookkeeping from home. She had a history of disputes with service providers, convinced most were trying to overcharge her or create unnecessary work. Neighbors described her as someone who believed she knew better than the experts and wasn't afraid to say so. That day, she was home alone when a technician arrived around 9:15 a.m. to inspect her gas meter. He identified a faulty pressure regulator and recommended shutting off the gas supply until repairs could be completed later that day. Rita became immediately confrontational, insisting her appliances worked fine and accusing him of creating unnecessary work to charge more money. She threatened to call his supervisor to complain. The technician shut off the main gas valve, tagged it with a warning label, and instructed her not to tamper with it. Rita stood visibly angry, criticizing him throughout. After the technician left, Rita remained outside near the meter, which was located on the exterior wall near her basement entrance. She had basic familiarity with the valve system from previous service calls and believed the technician had dramatically overreacted. Approximately 15 minutes after the technician departed, Rita returned to the gas meter. She removed the warning tag and used a wrench from her garage to reopen the main valve, turning it slowly until it opened fully. Gas began flowing into the basement through the supply line, but without the pilot light ignited, it began accumulating in the enclosed space. The basement had minimal ventilation, one small closed window, and no active exhaust system. The faulty regulator caused gas to flow at a higher rate than normal. Rita spent approximately 12 minutes upstairs before noticing the house felt colder. She went to the basement to check the furnace. As she descended the stairs, the concentration of natural gas in the air had reached a flammable level. The gas, which contained an added odorant, was now detectable, but Rita had already entered the space. Rita reached the furnace and attempted to relight the pilot manually using the built-in ignition button. The electrical spark from the ignition mechanism triggered an immediate explosion. The blast originated at the furnace and expanded rapidly through the basement, fueled by the accumulated gas. The explosion blew out the basement windows and caused the first floor to partially collapse into the basement. Rita was at the epicenter and was thrown against the concrete foundation wall. The force caused severe structural damage to the home and ignited a fire that spread through the debris. A neighbor 2 houses away heard the explosion and called emergency services immediately. First responders arrived within 6 minutes. The house was heavily damaged, with active fire in the basement and first-floor areas. Firefighters extinguished the blaze within 35 minutes and entered the basement once it was deemed structurally safe. Rita was found near the furnace area, severely injured and unresponsive. She was extracted and transported to a medical facility but was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The cause of death was multiple blunt force trauma and thermal injuries sustained in the explosion. Investigators found the main gas valve had been reopened and the warning tag removed. The technician's service report confirmed Rita had restored gas flow against explicit safety instructions.
It was April 29, 2017, when heavy spring storms flooded rural Texas, sending muddy water 2 feet deep across a remote low-water crossing as dark clouds lingered overhead. Diane Vance, a 52-year-old logistics worker, sat behind the wheel of her sedan. Known for her stubborn streak and tendency to challenge authority, Diane had chosen this back road as a shortcut home from weekend errands. The main highway would have added 15 minutes to her journey, and her impatience had grown throughout the day. A sheriff's deputy had positioned his patrol car near the crossing, directing drivers to turn around. The officer had spent the afternoon warning motorists about the dangerous conditions. When Diane approached, the deputy stepped forward and gestured for her to stop. The officer explained that the crossing was impassable and pointed toward the detour signs. Several other vehicles had already turned around after receiving similar warnings. Diane appeared to acknowledge the warning, but remained in her vehicle. After the deputy walked back toward other approaching cars, Diane suddenly accelerated around the displaced barricade and entered the flowing water. Her decision defied both common sense and direct police instruction. The deputy immediately began radioing for additional units. The sedan immediately lost traction on the slick concrete surface. The lateral current caught the vehicle's undercarriage and began pushing it sideways across the roadway. Within seconds, the car had rotated 90 degrees and was sliding toward a deep drainage channel that paralleled the crossing. The vehicle's momentum carried it over the channel's edge. As it tumbled down the embankment, the sedan rolled completely over, landing roof down in the rushing water. The impact shattered most of the windows. Water flooded the inverted passenger compartment rapidly through the broken glass. Emergency lights from the deputy's patrol car reflected off the churning surface. The current continued pushing the overturned vehicle downstream. The car came to rest against a concrete culvert approximately 50 yards from the crossing. Debris from upstream, tree branches, fence posts, and plastic containers accumulated against the wreckage, further pinning it in place. The rain intensified as emergency personnel began arriving at the scene. The deputy radioed for help and waded into the shallows, but the overturned sedan had been swept beyond reach. Swift water teams arrived 20 minutes later and found the car lodged against the drainage structure. Divers worked in near-zero visibility, feeling their way through the submerged wreckage. The water temperature had dropped with the storm, and the current made every movement difficult. They removed Diane from the flooded driver's seat. She was unresponsive and could not be revived despite immediate resuscitation attempts on the muddy bank. The county coroner later determined that Diane had died from drowning. The official incident report documented that the crossing had been properly marked as hazardous and that multiple warnings had been issued to drivers. Investigators found no mechanical defects with the vehicle and concluded that the death resulted from an unauthorized attempt to cross floodwaters despite clear warnings from law enforcement. Witnesses reported that Diane had seemed agitated before ignoring the deputy's instructions. The incident served as another reminder of flash flood dangers during severe weather events. Thanks for watching. Want to see more? Click on your screen now. It was May 25th, 2018, along Florida's Gulf Coast, Memorial Day weekend had brought record crowds to a popular marine aquarium. Families filled the exhibits under bright afternoon sun, with temperatures in the mid-80s, creating ideal conditions for outdoor attractions and scheduled presentations. 50-year-old Clarette Don arrived with her extended family during Memorial Day weekend, dressed in a lightweight cover-up over swim-ready attire. A travel content creator, she frequently filmed immersive destination reviews for her online audience, often seeking closer access than typical visitors. Her family was accustomed to her tendency to test policy boundaries when she believed guest restrictions were negotiable rather than absolute. The aquarium's main attraction was a large dolphin habitat used for scheduled educational presentations. Prominent signage stated that guest interaction and platform access were restricted to trained personnel only. Waist-high barriers separated visitors from the water, and alarmed, self-latching gates secured the staff-only walkways above the pool, which extended more than 15 feet at its deepest point. Clarette had researched dolphin swim programs offered at similar facilities and anticipated she might be able to arrange closer access for her channel. When staff explained that interactive programs required advance booking and were not included with general admission, she argued that as a paying guest, she should be allowed limited platform access for filming. She maintained that supervised entry for content creation was a reasonable request and believed the restriction was flexible rather than absolute. Security responded as visitors paused to watch. While staff attempted to de-escalate, a marine trainer exited through a staff-only gate to reposition equipment. As the gate closed behind him, Clarette quickly followed before it fully latched, stepping onto the restricted platform above the water. Witnesses shouted warnings. Trainers radioed for emergency response while moving toward her. Ignoring repeated instructions to return, she moved farther along the narrow walkway, continuing her live stream. When security reached the secured gate, they had to wait for controlled access from inside. Without authorization, Clarette lowered herself from the platform's edge and dropped into the pool, feet first, without flotation support. Witness footage later showed her striking the back of her head against the concrete edge during entry before submerging. The impact and sudden immersion left her visibly disoriented. Although the water was not dangerously cold, she surfaced breathing hard and looking around as if unsure where the nearest exit ladder was located. Her movements appeared unsteady as her breathing became increasingly frantic against the smooth habitat walls. During repeated attempts to breathe, she aspirated water and submerged. When she resurfaced, her movements appeared slowed and poorly coordinated. Staff deployed flotation devices, while a designated rescue diver entered from a controlled ladder. Within approximately 90 seconds, responders reached her as she slipped beneath the surface again. She was lifted from the pool as personnel initiated CPR on the deck. Paramedics transported her to a nearby hospital. Physicians later determined she sustained a head injury during entry and subsequently aspirated water while disoriented, resulting in prolonged oxygen deprivation and hypoxic brain injury. Despite advanced life support, she did not recover. The investigation concluded she had bypassed barriers, followed authorized personnel through a secured access point, ignored instructions, and entered a restricted habitat without authorization. A safety review confirmed that circulation systems, intake covers, alarms, and infrastructure met regulatory standards. The death was ruled accidental following unauthorized entry into a restricted area. After required inspections and coordination with authorities, the dolphin exhibit resumed operations. Portions of her live stream were reviewed as part of the official report, documenting the sequence of events preceding the incident. It was November 2016, and a cold front had settled over Gary, Indiana, bringing temperatures down to the mid-30s, with intermittent sleet that made surfaces treacherous. The industrial landscape was dotted with active rail lines that carried freight trains through the heart of the Rust Belt city. At a particular crossing, red warning lights flashed rhythmically, as the automated gate arm lowered to block vehicular traffic. Corinne Wild, a 49-year-old warehouse supervisor known for her aggressive temperament and confrontational attitude toward delays, had been stuck behind the lowered gate for several minutes. Her impatient nature and history of verbal altercations with authority figures made her a difficult presence in most professional settings. The crossing's warning system had activated properly, with bells clanging and lights flashing to indicate an approaching freight train. The locomotive's horn sounded repeatedly as it approached the intersection, following standard safety protocols for urban crossings. Corinne exited her vehicle and approached the emergency communication box mounted near the gate mechanism. She began shouting into the intercom, demanding that operators raise the gate immediately and accusing them of deliberately wasting her time. A passenger in her vehicle urged her to return to the car and wait for the train to pass, but Corinne's frustration had escalated beyond reason. She kicked the gate arm repeatedly, causing it to shake on its mounting bracket. The warning lights continued their urgent flashing pattern, while the train's horn grew progressively louder. Despite the obvious danger signals and her passengers' continued pleas, Corinne stepped around the gate barrier and onto the gravel ballast that supported the railroad tracks. The uneven surface consisted of loose stones of varying sizes, creating an unstable walking platform that became even more treacherous in the sleet-dampened conditions. As Corinne attempted to step over the near rail, her foot caught on the irregular ballast stones. She stumbled forward, losing her balance on the slippery gravel surface. Her leg landed directly across the steel rail, just as the locomotive rounded the final curve before the crossing. The freight train, traveling within posted speed limits through the urban crossing, struck Corinne's lower body with devastating force. Her lower body sustained severe traumatic injuries upon impact. The force of the collision threw her torso clear of the tracks, but the damage had already been done. Death occurred within minutes due to massive internal bleeding and traumatic shock. The train's engineer initiated emergency braking immediately upon seeing her on the tracks, but the train required nearly a quarter-mile to come to a complete stop. Emergency responders arrived within minutes of the engineer's radio call to dispatch. Railroad investigators documented the scene thoroughly, noting the position of Corinne's vehicle, the functioning warning systems, and witness statements from her passenger. The locomotive's event recorder confirmed that all safety protocols had been followed, including proper horn signals and adherence to posted speed limits. Security cameras mounted at the intersection captured the entire sequence of events, showing Corinne's deliberate circumvention of the safety barriers and her subsequent fall onto the active tracks. The footage clearly demonstrated that the warning systems had been operating correctly. The medical examiner ruled the death accidental, noting that the victim had trespassed on active railroad property despite functioning safety equipment and clear warning signals. The investigation concluded that Corinne's death resulted from her decision to ignore multiple safety warnings and enter a restricted area during active train operations.